My name is Eleanor Whitmore. I am 28 years old, and for the first 15 years of my life, I lived as a stranger inside my own household. 13 years ago, during the most violent ice storm to ever batter the Connecticut shoreline, my father stared at me with absolute contempt. "Get out," he barked over the cracking branches outside. "I will not raise a defective daughter in this house." I was 15 years old. I stood on the slate front steps shaking, the freezing sleet already soaking through the wool of my sweater. The reason I was being discarded like a broken appliance was simple. My older brother Bennett had told a meticulous, calculated lie to protect his own future. My parents swallowed his tears without a single question. They always did. 3 hours later, the police were calling my house. I had not made it to safety. I had been struck by a delivery van that skidded on a sheet of black ice along Route 95. I was thrown into a frozen drainage ditch and rushed to the trauma bay at Yale New Haven Hospital. When my father pushed open the door to that hospital room later that night, his shoulders were squared with confidence. He fully expected to charm a tired social worker, paint me as an unstable runaway, and walk out with the narrative firmly in his pocket. Instead, he froze in the doorway. The color drained from his face. His hands began to shake violently. Sitting in the cheap vinyl chair beside my hospital bed was not a doctor. It was not a nurse. It was not a police officer. It was his estranged mother, Grandma Adelaide. She was a brilliant commercial real estate magnate who had cut my father off completely 10 years earlier because she refused to underwrite his entitled, lazy lifestyle. She sat there in a flawless ivory suit, untouched by the chaos of the emergency department, holding my bruised hand with quiet, iron resolve. "You," my father stammered, his voice cracking. "You cannot be in this room." Before I tell you exactly how my grandmother dismantled my toxic family piece by piece, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Only do it if you have ever survived a manipulative sibling, or if you know exactly what it feels like to be the designated scapegoat in your own home. I would also love to know where you are watching from right now. Drop your city and state in the comments below. Now let me take you back to the quiet coastal suburbs of Old Greenwich, Connecticut, where my nightmare first began. To understand Bennett's lie, you have to understand the rigid hierarchy that ruled our four-bedroom colonial. In our family, sons were treated like emperors. Daughters were trained to be invisible. Bennett held the throne. My parents treated his constant failures like undiscovered brilliance. If he crashed a boat, the harbor was poorly marked. If he failed a class, the teacher had a personal vendetta. Meanwhile, I learned to shrink myself before I learned to ride a bicycle. I paid for my own school supplies by tutoring younger kids at the local library, absorbing the brutal truth that my accomplishments would never register on my parents' radar. Bennett knew this. He weaponized it. And that weapon is exactly what he aimed at my chest when his own future started crumbling. The Old Greenwich house looked like a postcard from the street. It had pristine white clapboard siding, black shutters, an immaculate boxwood hedge, and a circular driveway lined with crushed seashells. But inside, the house ran on an unspoken caste system. Bennett occupied the top floor of our family pyramid. I lived somewhere beneath the foundation. My parents, Richard and Margaret, treated Bennett like a misunderstood genius waiting to be discovered by the world. He was 2 years older than me, tall, athletic, with a charming grin that could disarm grandmothers and traffic cops with equal ease. He used that grin to slide through life without putting in a single ounce of legitimate effort. When he came home with disappointing report cards, my mother blamed the rigid public school curriculum. She insisted his teachers failed to appreciate his unconventional intelligence. My father agreed. He paid for expensive private tutoring sessions that Bennett routinely skipped to go sailing with his friends at the yacht club. The disparity inside our home was never subtle. It was the air we breathed. I saw it most clearly the autumn Bennett crashed his first car. He was 16 years old. He took his BMW out on a Friday night and went street racing along the coastal road. He came home hours after midnight. He reeked of expensive cologne and burnt clutch fluid. He stood in the kitchen and told my parents he had wrecked the entire vehicle. He claimed a deer leaped into the road from nowhere. He insisted he was lucky to be alive. My father did not yell. He did not ask a single follow-up question. He poured Bennett a glass of orange juice and clapped him on the shoulder. He said these things happen to young men with bright futures. The decision was final, sealed, and absolutely non-negotiable. She will be transferred to my estate in Greenwich the moment she is medically cleared for discharge. I am assuming full legal guardianship. You cannot simply take my child, my father stammered. But his voice held no genuine conviction. It was a weak, reflexive protest. I can, and I will, Adelaide corrected him. If you attempt to obstruct this guardianship transfer, if you try to drag her back to that colonial prison to serve as your designated scapegoat, I will unleash a legal nightmare upon your household. I will sue you personally for child endangerment, criminal negligence, and reckless endangerment of a minor during a declared state emergency. I will drag your pristine reputation through public court records across the entire eastern seaboard. The legal fees alone will bankrupt you before Labor Day. She took one calculated step closer to him, invading his personal space, using the exact intimidation tactic he had used on me hours earlier. But Adelaide possessed the capital to back up every threat she made. I know you took out a second mortgage on the old Greenwich property to fund Bennett's BMW and his Princeton tuition deposit, Adelaide whispered. Her tone was deadly and precise. You are dangerously overleveraged, Richard. You are drowning in consumer debt. Fight me on this guardianship, and I promise you will lose that colonial before Christmas morning. You will be standing in the street, just like you forced her to do tonight. The trap snapped completely shut. The options were laid bare on the tray table. My father could fight for his daughter, face public humiliation, and lose his comfortable suburban facade. Or he could surrender his daughter, walk away quietly, and preserve his fragile financial illusion. It was the easiest decision he ever made in his life. My father looked down at the floor. His shaking hands retreated deeper into the pockets of his trench coat. He did not look at me. He looked at Adelaide, gave a single stiff, defeated nod, and turned around toward the door. My mother lingered for one final second. This was her moment to break ranks. This was the moment for a mother to rush to her daughter's bedside, to hold her injured child, to beg for forgiveness, to promise change. I stared at her, waiting for a single flicker of maternal instinct to override my father's cowardice. Margaret Whitmore looked at my bruised face. She clutched her expensive leather handbag tighter against her ribs. And she turned her back on me. She followed my father out the heavy wooden door. The door swung shut behind them, sealing the exit. They did not say goodbye. They prioritized their comfort and their golden son over their daughter's life without a single backward glance. The silence returned to the trauma room, broken only by the steady beeping of the heart monitor. My pulse remained perfectly calm. I waited for the grief to arrive. I waited for the devastating heartbreak of being abandoned by the people who had created me. The heartbreak never came. Instead, an enormous, overwhelming wave of clarity washed through my exhausted mind. That night in the trauma ward, watching the people responsible for my existence walk away to save their own reputations, I learned the most important lesson of my entire life. Blood means nothing. Biology is just a genetic lottery ticket. It does not guarantee loyalty. It does not guarantee love. It does not guarantee protection. Family is not determined by a birth certificate or a shared last name. Family is the person who sits in the uncomfortable vinyl hospital chair after the storm passes. Family is the person who builds a fortress around you when the rest of the world has thrown you into a ditch. Adelaide sat back down in the chair. She smoothed the wrinkles from her skirt and picked up her cell phone. Rest now, Eleanor. My grandmother said, her eyes already focused on drafting a fresh email. We have a transfer to arrange in the morning. I closed my eyes. The pain in my collarbone dulled into a manageable ache. For the first time in 15 years, I felt completely safe. The ghost of old Greenwich was dead. A new life was about to begin in the back country of Greenwich. The discharge papers from the trauma ward were finalized 3 days later. Adelaide did not drive me back to the Colonial in Old Greenwich. Instead, a private black sedan transported us north into the back country, deep into the wooded hills of Upper Greenwich. Her estate sat behind tall wrought iron gates, surrounded by ancient hemlock trees and centuries-old stone walls. It was a fortress of cut granite and disciplined silence. Inside, the house smelled of beeswax polish, old leather, and freshly cut hydrangeas. There was no shouting here. There was no walking on eggshells to placate a fragile golden boy. There was no dodging the venom of an insecure father. There was only structure, silence, and absolute safety. My fractured clavicle required 8 weeks of intensive physical therapy at a private clinic in Stamford. During my recovery, Adelaide did not coddle me. She did not treat me like a broken victim who needed gentle handling. She treated me like a raw asset that required refining and deployment. She spent every morning in a sunlit breakfast room overlooking her formal rose garden, reviewing dense commercial real estate contracts. She noticed my habit of reading the financial sections of the New York Times she left folded on the linen tablecloth. She noticed how quickly I could calculate property tax percentages in my head, a skill I had sharpened counting tips and balancing the register during my late shifts at the clam shack. One morning, she set her porcelain teacup down on its saucer and looked at me over the rim of her tortoiseshell reading glasses. She delivered the philosophy that would become the architecture of my new life. "Tears are useless currency, Eleanor," she said, her tone steady and pragmatic. "Crying will not purchase you safety. Empathy will not shield you from a predator. Information, leverage, and capital. That is how you protect yourself. That is the only armor the real world respects." I absorbed her words into my bones. Adelaide enrolled me in an elite preparatory academy in Greenwich. I no longer had to scrub fryer baskets to pay for my own exam fees. Adelaide funded my education completely, but she demanded excellence in return. I delivered. I did not merely earn top grades. I developed a fierce, singular obsession with forensic accounting. My brother had taught me how a liar operates on a small domestic scale. He had hidden his theft inside my backpack and used a false narrative to escape consequences. I wanted to understand how liars operated on a massive corporate scale. I wanted to know how they structured their deceit. I treated balance sheets like crime scenes. I studied offshore tax havens, shell corporations, phantom payrolls, and round-trip transactions. While my classmates attended lacrosse tournaments and weekend regattas, I read dense case studies on embezzlement schemes and wire fraud convictions. I learned that numbers never lie, even when the people writing them down do. A discrepancy always casts a shadow somewhere on the ledger. I carried that obsession straight into Wharton. I graduated near the top of my class, passed my certified public accountant exams on the first attempt, and immediately pursued my credentials as a certified fraud examiner. By the time I was 26, I was working for a premier financial investigation firm headquartered in Midtown Manhattan. I spent my days unwinding complex white-collar crimes. I traced hidden assets, dismantled shell corporations, and exposed financial illusions for institutional clients. I became a professional ghost hunter, tracking the money that corrupt men tried to bury offshore. While I built my career, I simultaneously constructed a titanium wall between myself and my biological parents. I changed my cell phone number the morning I turned 18. I instructed the security desk at my office building to refuse any visitors matching their descriptions. Whenever a piece of forwarded mail arrived at my apartment in Tribeca bearing my mother's handwriting, I dropped it straight into the cross-cut shredder without ever opening the envelope. I erased them from my daily existence. I was finally breathing free air, unburdened by their constant demands for my submission and their relentless protection of my brother. But cutting ties does not silence a suburban rumor mill. Connecticut is a small state and financial circles tend to overlap in unpredictable ways. Over the next decade, the grapevine delivered consistent, unsolicited updates about the golden child. Bennett had somehow scraped his way to a marketing degree from a mediocre state school after Princeton rescinded his admission. He had parlayed his natural charisma and my father's remaining country club connections into a corporate finance job at a boutique firm. He now called himself a portfolio strategist. He had relocated to an expensive condo in Westport. He had married a woman named Charlotte whose entire personality revolved around visual status and Instagram engagement. She came from a family of mid-level executives in New Canaan who valued appearances over substance, making her the perfect enabler for Bennett's lifelong charade. I saw their carefully curated photographs through mutual acquaintances on social media. They played the role of modern American royalty. Bennett drove a leased Maserati Gran Turismo. Charlotte wore heavy David Yurman bracelets and carried rare Hermes handbags that cost more than a reliable used sedan. They posted artfully filtered images from luxury yacht charters in Nantucket and ski weekends in Stowe. They posed with crystal flutes of champagne at exclusive charity galas in Westport and Darien, smiling broadly, projecting an image of effortless prosperity. They wanted the world to believe they were untouchable. They appeared flawless to the untrained eye. But I did not have an untrained eye. I examined their lifestyle through the clinical, ruthless lens of a fraud investigator. I evaluated their visual output the exact same way I evaluated a corporate tax return. I knew the standard compensation range for a junior portfolio strategist at his firm. I knew the soaring property taxes in his Fairfield County zip code. I knew the retail price of Charlotte's seasonal wardrobe and the exorbitant weekly rates for chartered sailboats off the Massachusetts coast. I ran the numbers in my head while sitting at my desk on Park Avenue. The math simply did not work. The visible expenditure dramatically exceeded the plausible income. When a lifestyle outpaces legitimate revenue by such a wide margin, it requires a constant influx of shadow capital. It requires massive hidden debt or hidden theft. I watched the numbers from a distance, recognizing the exact pattern of behavior Bennett had displayed since childhood. He was stealing from one source to fund another, just like he had stolen from our mother's handbag. Flashy, desperate displays of wealth almost always covered deep structural rot. Bennett was constructing an elaborate house of cards, stacking expensive lies on top of hollow foundations. He was surviving on borrowed time and borrowed money. And in the world of finance, the bill always comes due eventually. The audit always arrives. I knew his deficit was expanding every single quarter. The only question remaining was who he would attempt to sacrifice when the debt collectors finally arrived at his door. By the time I turned 28, my office occupied the 38th floor of a glass tower overlooking Bryant Park. I had earned my reputation by breaking down intricate white-collar crimes. I spent my days dissecting offshore bank accounts, tracing phantom wire transfers, and unwinding complex corporate embezzlement structures. I knew exactly how to find the shadow ledgers. I understood that arrogance always leaves a paper trail. My primary clients were institutional banks attempting to recover stolen capital from rogue executives. I was extraordinarily effective at my work because Bennett had taught me a fundamental truth very early in life. Predators rely entirely on the silence and the shame of their victims. In my career, I never stayed silent. I exposed them with undeniable mathematics. My weekdays belonged to the relentless rhythm of Manhattan. But my weekends belonged to backcountry Greenwich. Adelaide was now 84 years old. Time had thinned her frame and turned her hair the color of fresh snow. She required a carved walnut cane to navigate the long stone hallways of the estate. Her physical strength was diminishing, but her intellect remained absolutely lethal. We spent every Saturday afternoon sitting in her glass-enclosed conservatory. We drank Earl Grey tea from her grandmother's porcelain service and discussed market trends, asset reallocation, and the management of her vast commercial real estate portfolio. She was preparing for the end of her life with the same meticulous strategy she applied to corporate acquisitions. She refused to leave loose ends behind her. On a crisp October afternoon, she bypassed our usual portfolio review. The autumn sunlight cutting through the conservatory glass illuminated the deep lines around her clear blue eyes. She placed a thick manila folder on the wrought iron table between us. She told me she had retained a private investigations firm 6 months earlier. She had instructed her investigators to monitor the golden child closely. She knew my father and my brother were hovering on the edges of our lives like vultures. They were waiting patiently for her heart to stop beating. They expected an enormous payout. She intended to give them a reckoning instead. I pulled the documents from the folder. My trained eyes scanned the spreadsheets, the bank statements, and the background reports. It took my mind less than 4 minutes to categorize the disaster. Bennett was not merely living beyond his means. He was orchestrating a textbook Ponzi scheme. He operated an unregistered investment fund out of a rented office suite in Stamford. His promotional materials promised his country club clients a guaranteed 14% annual return. In the financial sector, a guaranteed double-digit return with zero market correlation is a screaming siren for fraud. Bennett did not trade equities. He did not invest in municipal bonds or technology startups. He simply deposited fresh investor capital into a central operating account. He used those new funds to pay artificial dividends to his older clients, creating the illusion of a wildly successful portfolio. He skimmed enormous amounts off the top to finance his leased Maserati, his Nantucket yacht charters, and Charlotte's growing collection of designer handbags. He was burning through stolen capital at a terrifying velocity. The deficit was expanding every single month. I read through his fabricated quarterly statements. They were sloppy. They lacked basic compliance markers required by the Securities and Exchange Commission. He was surviving entirely on his superficial charm and the unearned trust of his wealthy, financially unsophisticated social circle. I turned the page to the master ledger detailing his primary investors. My breath caught in my throat. Sitting at the very top of the list, holding the largest single account, were Richard and Margaret Whitmore. The documents outlined a timeline of catastrophic financial decisions. My parents had extracted every ounce of equity from the old Greenwich Colonial. They had liquidated their retirement accounts. They had cashed out their life insurance policies. They had handed their entire net worth to their golden child, trusting their financial prodigy to multiply their wealth. They were funding his extravagant lifestyle while actively engineering their own destitution. They believed they were investing in a genius. In reality, they were feeding a parasite. I looked up from the folder. Adelaide was watching me. Her expression was unreadable. She asked for my professional assessment. I placed the papers back on the wrought iron table. I told her Bennett was months away from a complete liquidity crisis. The moment one large investor requested a full cash withdrawal, the central operating account would drain instantly. The entire structure would implode. The Securities and Exchange Commission would seize his assets. He would face federal wire fraud charges in the Southern District of New York. My parents would lose their colonial and their entire retirement in a single devastating stroke. They would be left with nothing. Adelaide smiled. It was a sharp, calculating expression that sent a small chill through the warm conservatory. She leaned back in her wrought iron chair and rested both hands on the carved head of her cane. They believe they are inheriting my money, Adelaide said, her voice barely above a whisper, yet carrying the absolute weight of a federal judge delivering a sentence. Richard assumes he is the natural heir. He assumes my death will provide the capital required to cover Bennett's inevitable collapse. They are floating their entire existence on the assumption of my generosity. She reached across the table and tapped her elegant index finger against the manila folder. We are going to give them exactly what they deserve, Adelaide stated. She did not want to simply rewrite her will to exclude them. A simple disinheritance would allow them to play the wounded victims. They would complain to their remaining friends about the cruel, heartless matriarch. Adelaide wanted to construct a financial mirror. She wanted to force them to confront the exact monster they had nurtured for 30 years. She wanted to strip away their suburban facade and expose the rot festering underneath. She dictated the terms of her estate to me that afternoon. We called her primary attorney, Miss Pemberton, the following Monday and finalized every document. Adelaide locked her assets behind airtight legal parameters. She engineered a scenario where their own greed would serve as the catalyst for their destruction. She transformed her legacy into a precision trap, baiting it with the one thing Richard and Bennett valued above all else: unearned wealth. Adelaide passed away peacefully in her sleep 4 weeks later. The transition was quiet. I sat by her bed in the early hours of the morning, holding her cool hand, mourning the only true parent I had ever known. I wept for the woman who had pulled me out of the ice storm and taught me how to forge my own armor. I handled the immediate arrangements with the funeral director, ensuring every detail aligned with her strict standards of elegance and dignity. But grief in the Whitmore family never gets to linger undisturbed. The moment her obituary appeared in the Greenwich Time and the New York Times, the isolation broke. The predators caught the scent of blood in the water. The trap was officially set. The targets were already flying directly toward the bait. The silence of the Greenwich estate was about to be shattered by the arrival of the vultures. Adelaide orchestrated her own memorial service with the same ruthless precision she had applied to her corporate mergers. She explicitly forbade open caskets, melodramatic eulogies, and public displays of weeping. She had requested a brief, dignified graveside service at the historic cemetery in Greenwich, followed by a catered reception at the backcountry estate. The guest list consisted of her legal team, her financial advisors, and the handful of trusted colleagues who had proven their loyalty across decades. It was an elegant, somber afternoon. The autumn air was crisp. The estate grounds looked immaculate. Then the front doors swung open, and the intruders arrived. My biological family crossed the threshold of the Greenwich estate like a conquering army wearing tailored mourning wear. They had not spoken a single word to Adelaide in 10 years. They had been banned from this property. Yet they walked into the grand foyer projecting the unmistakable aura of rightful heirs returning to claim their kingdom. I stood near the catering tables in the formal dining room, holding a crystal glass of sparkling water, watching the performance unfold. It was a masterclass in behavioral fraud. My trained eyes broke down their movements, analyzing their tells the same way I analyzed a fabricated tax return. My father entered first. He wore a crisp dark navy suit and a somber, dignified expression. He immediately began moving through the crowd, shaking hands with Adelaide's business partners. He introduced himself as the grieving son and the new patriarch of the Whitmore family. He acted as though he were hosting the reception, offering condolences for a woman he had despised. He was playing a role, desperate to establish his authority over the territory before the will was even read. My mother flanked him, dabbing at her perfectly dry eyes with an embroidered linen handkerchief. She played the supportive, heartbroken wife. She nodded along to every fabrication my father offered to the assembled guests. But my focus quickly shifted to the younger generation. Bennett and Charlotte strolled into the room, and the sheer visual volume of their entitlement was almost suffocating. Bennett wore a custom-tailored black suit that fit just a fraction too tightly. The silent indicator of a man trying desperately to project success. Charlotte walked beside him wearing oversized dark sunglasses indoors and a wide-brimmed black hat that obscured half her face. She clutched a quilted Hermes Birkin against her side like a defensive shield. Charlotte came from a family of mid-level corporate executives in New Canaan that had quietly filed for bankruptcy when she was a teenager. That early loss of status had infected her with a terminal case of material desperation. She needed to be perceived as wealthy to feel valid as a human being. She had married Bennett because he had promised her an endless runway of luxury. Now that the runway was crumbling under his hidden debt, she was searching for a bailout as desperately as he was. Her head swiveled constantly. She was not looking at the mourning guests. She was taking inventory. Her eyes darted from the antique oriental rugs to the crystal chandeliers hanging above the dining table. She reached out and traced her manicured fingers along the edge of an 18th-century Chinese porcelain vase displayed on a mahogany pedestal. I could practically see the auction estimates running behind her dark sunglasses. Bennett left his wife to appraise the furnishings and began scanning the room. He spotted me standing near the tall French windows overlooking the rose garden. We had not occupied the same physical space in 13 years. The last time I had seen him, he had been hiding behind our mother, smirking, while our father shoved me into a freezing ice storm. He did not hesitate. He adjusted his silk tie, squared his shoulders, and sauntered across the dining room toward me. His approach was fascinating to observe. A normal person carrying the weight of his past actions would display visible hesitation. A normal person would feel shame. But Bennett operated on a narcissistic frequency that simply erased any history that did not serve his current objective. He needed to secure his inheritance, so he had decided to play the role of the benevolent older brother. "Eleanor," he said. His voice was smooth, coated in a thick layer of artificial warmth. "It has been a long time. You look well." He lifted his left wrist to adjust his cufflink, making a deliberate motion to expose the heavy gold Patek Philippe wrapped around his wrist. It was a classic dominance display. He wanted to remind me of his manufactured wealth before the negotiation even began. I did not reply to his greeting. I took a slow, measured sip of my sparkling water and let the silence stretch between us. In interrogation, silence is the sharpest available weapon. It forces the liar to keep talking to fill the void. Bennett shifted his weight from one polished Oxford to the other. A tiny muscle twitched along his jawline. The silence was making him uncomfortable, but his ego pushed him forward. "Look, I know things were complicated between us when we were kids," Bennett continued. He dropped his voice into a conspiratorial whisper. "We all made mistakes back then. But we are adults now. We have to focus on the big picture together." I watched a single bead of sweat form at his hairline. He was desperate. The Ponzi scheme was collapsing around him in real time, and he viewed Adelaide's death as his personal lifeboat. He just needed to make sure I did not rock the boat before he could climb aboard. "Dad is the only surviving son," Bennett said, leaning closer, invading my personal space. "You know how Grandma was. She was old-school East Coast money. Old-fashioned values. Dad inherits the primary estate. The assets flow down through the men of the family. That is the tradition." The sheer audacity of his pitch was breathtaking. He was standing inside a house owned and built by a self-made female commercial real estate magnate, trying to tell me that wealth inherently belonged to men. He was demanding my submission based on the exact same patriarchal entitlement that had allowed him to destroy my childhood. He expected me to nod politely, step aside, and let him plunder the vault unopposed. "You will be taken care of," Bennett added quickly, misreading my silence as hesitation. "We can arrange a comfortable allowance for you. Enough to pay off your student loans. Enough for a nice little condo somewhere quiet. But the bulk of the estate goes to the family name. We just need to present a united front when the lawyers start reading the paperwork next week." Charlotte drifted over to join him. She slipped her arm possessively through his and offered me a tight smile. The smile did not reach her eyes. "This house has such wonderful bones," Charlotte chimed in, looking up at the carved crown molding. "Bennett and I were just discussing how it would make an absolutely stunning summer retreat once we modernize the interior. The decor is just so dated." I looked at the brother who had framed me for theft to save his own failing academic record. I looked at the man who was currently stealing millions of dollars from his country club friends to lease sports cars and charter sailboats. He stood there projecting such absolute confidence. He had no concept of the danger he was actually standing in. He believed he was manipulating his scared, invisible younger sister. He was completely unaware that he was standing on a trapdoor, and my hand was already resting on the lever. I lowered my crystal glass. I met his gaze directly. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with the flat, clinical tone of a surgeon holding a scalpel. "There will not be anything ugly, Bennett," I said. Bennett smiled, relaxing his shoulders. He thought he had won. He thought the transaction was already complete. "The will reading is scheduled for Thursday afternoon," I continued, keeping my eyes locked on his. "The firm is located on Park Avenue in Manhattan. I highly recommend you bring your accountant." The smug smile froze on his face. His eyes darted back and forth as he tried to process the specific phrasing of my sentence. Why would he possibly need an accountant? What did I know about his ledgers? A flash of genuine panic broke through the polished veneer of the portfolio strategist. The Patek Philippe suddenly looked very heavy on his wrist. I did not wait for him to formulate a follow-up question. I turned my back on him, walked across the dining room, and exited through the French doors onto the stone terrace. I left him standing next to his status-obsessed wife, surrounded by antiques he would never own, drowning in a sudden, terrifying wave of confusion. The reception was over. The pleasantries were finished. The stage was now set for the mahogany conference room on Park Avenue, where the final audit of the Whitmore family was about to commence. Thursday afternoon arrived with a sharp, biting wind that swept down the avenues of Midtown Manhattan. The legal offices of Pemberton and Associates occupied the top floor of a sleek glass tower overlooking Park Avenue. The environment had been intentionally designed to intimidate. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a sweeping view of the Manhattan skyline. The interior was an unforgiving landscape of frosted glass panels, polished chrome fixtures, and heavy walnut paneling. It was a fortress of legal machinery, located a world away from the manicured lawns and comfortable delusions of old Greenwich. My father walked into the conference room first. He unbuttoned his suit jacket and immediately claimed the large leather chair at the head of the long mahogany table. It was a subtle, deliberate maneuver intended to establish his dominance over the impending proceedings. He leaned back, resting his forearms on the armrests, projecting the smug satisfaction of a man who believed a lifetime of financial mismanagement was about to be erased by simple biology. He believed he was the rightful king awaiting a royal decree. He surveyed the room with a relaxed, almost bored expression. Bennett and Charlotte entered next, vibrating with a poorly concealed, frantic energy. Charlotte carried yet another designer handbag today. A rare crocodile Hermes that cost more than my first apartment in Tribeca. She sat down and immediately began scrolling through high-end real estate listings in the Hamptons on her phone, her manicured fingers tapping rapidly across the glowing screen. Bennett sat beside her, radiating arrogance. He leaned in and whispered something in her ear that made her giggle behind her hand. Through the steady, low hum of the climate control system, I caught fragments of their hushed conversation. He was discussing nautical dimensions and marina docking fees in Sag Harbor. I learned later that very morning, fueled by pure unadulterated hubris, Bennett had wired an $80,000 non-refundable deposit to a broker in Newport to secure a 50-foot sailing yacht. He had used the last of the liquid funds remaining in his fraudulent investment pool to make the transfer. He had bet his entire survival on a $60 million windfall he assumed was waiting inside a legal binder. He was spending a fortune he did not actually possess, driven by the desperate need to maintain his facade for a few more weeks. My mother sat to the right of my father. She reached across the polished wood and patted Bennett's forearm, beaming at him with maternal pride. She glanced at me exactly once. It was a brief, dismissive look that slid right off my shoulders without leaving a mark. She viewed me as a minor inconvenience, invited only out of legal obligation to witness the triumph of the men in her life. She adjusted her pearl necklace and turned her full attention back to her preferred son. I sat directly opposite them. I did not check my phone. I did not engage in small talk. I rested my hands flat on top of a thick manila folder resting on the mahogany surface. The folder contained the complete forensic audit of Bennett's shadow ledgers. It contained the wire transfer records, the fabricated dividend statements, and the absolute irrefutable proof that my parents had mortgaged their entire future to feed their son's endless greed. The paper inside that folder felt heavy. It felt like holding a loaded weapon with the safety switched off. I remained entirely silent. My posture straight. My breathing measured. My heart rate perfectly steady. The heavy frosted glass door swung open. Miss Pemberton entered the room. She was a veteran estate litigator in her late 50s, known throughout the New York and Connecticut legal communities for her sharp intellect and her absolute zero tolerance for nonsense. Adelaide had retained her for a reason. Miss Pemberton was an impartial executioner. She wore a tailored charcoal suit and carried a thick leather-bound binder pressed against her side. She did not offer warm greetings or false sympathy to the grieving family. She walked directly to the opposite end of the table, sat down, opened the binder, and arranged her wire-rimmed glasses on the bridge of her nose. "Good afternoon," Miss Pemberton stated. Her voice projected effortlessly across the long table, cutting cleanly through the murmurs. "We are here to execute the final testament of Adelaide Whitmore." The room fell silent. My father adjusted his posture, sitting up just slightly straighter. Bennett stopped whispering to Charlotte. The moment they had been waiting for since the funeral had finally arrived. Before we proceed to the specific asset distribution, Miss Pemberton continued, her eyes scanning the document before her. "I must read a preliminary clause mandated by the deceased." Mrs. Whitmore left explicit instructions regarding the fundamental conditions of her legacy. Bennett shifted impatiently in his leather chair, crossing his legs. He shot a quick annoyed glance at the expensive watch on his wrist. He was already irritated by the procedural delay. He wanted the payout, not a posthumous lecture on morality. Miss Pemberton looked up from the page. Her gaze swept over my father, then settled directly on my brother. Mrs. Whitmore left instructions stating that her wealth is not an entitlement based on bloodline. She dictated that all assets must be distributed based strictly on demonstrated merit, personal integrity, and complete financial transparency. The words hovered in the cold, conditioned air of the conference room. A normal person harboring millions of dollars in fraudulent debt would hear the phrase financial transparency and experience immediate panic. A rational mind would recognize the inherent danger of a forensic audit. But Bennett did not possess a rational mind. He operated on a frequency of pure, unfiltered narcissism. He believed his own lies so completely that he assumed everyone else in the world was equally fooled. He thought he was untouchable. Bennett let out a short, dismissive scoff. He leaned back further in his chair, lacing his fingers together behind his head in a posture of extreme relaxation. Yeah, we get it, Bennett said, rolling his eyes toward the recessed ceiling lights. Grandma loved her rules. She loved hearing the sound of her own voice. Can we please skip the moral grandstanding and just read the numbers? We all have places to be this afternoon. My mother smiled proudly at him. She admired his confidence. She thought he looked like a young, decisive executive commanding a corporate boardroom. She had no concept that she was watching her favorite son tighten a noose around his own neck. I did not blink. I kept my eyes locked on Bennett. I let the silence stretch across the mahogany table. I was waiting for the exact moment the oxygen left the room. I need to pause the story here for a moment and ask you a question. Have you ever watched a narcissist realize they are not the smartest person in the room? Have you ever witnessed the precise millisecond their fabricated reality shatters against an impenetrable wall of facts? If you have survived a toxic family dynamic, or if you have ever dealt with a compulsive liar, you know exactly what the silence before the storm feels like. It is a dense, vibrating quiet. It is the sound of an illusion running out of borrowed time. Drop a yes in the comments below if you know exactly what feeling I am describing. Bennett noticed my stare. His confident smirk faltered for a fraction of a second. He dropped his hands to the table, uncrossed his legs, and suddenly became hyper-aware of the thick manila folder resting beneath my palms. He looked at the folder, then back up to my face. The first microscopic seed of doubt planted itself in his mind. He tried to brush it off, forcing a tight, patronizing smile in my direction, pretending he was still in total control. But the temperature in the room had already shifted. The atmosphere had grown heavy, suffocating, thick with impending ruin. Miss Pemberton ignored Bennett's arrogant interruption. She turned the thick parchment page of the legal binder. The rustle of the heavy paper sounded like a guillotine blade being drawn slowly upward, locking into position. The time for polite suburban fiction was officially over. The era of the golden child was ending today. Miss Pemberton cleared her throat. The sound echoed sharply in the cavernous conference room, cutting through the low hum of the climate control system. She began with my father. To my son, Richard Whitmore, she read. Her voice carried the unmistakable rigid cadence of Adelaide herself. I leave the mortgage to the old Greenwich property. My father frowned. The smug satisfaction melted into genuine confusion. He leaned forward, holding up a hand to stop the lawyer mid-sentence. Wait, my father said, his brow furrowing as he tried to correct her. There is a clerical error in the document. I already own that house. I just hold a standard mortgage with First Connecticut Savings Bank. It is not an asset she has the power to bequeath to me. Miss Pemberton lowered the heavy binder to the table. She looked at him over the rim of her glasses with the exhausted patience of a teacher correcting a slow student. There is no error, Richard, the lawyer stated calmly. 6 years ago, your primary lender initiated quiet foreclosure proceedings against your Colonial due to a series of missed payments. You were desperate to keep this fact concealed from your social circle in Old Greenwich. You sought private high-interest refinancing to maintain your country club lifestyle. My father shifted uncomfortably in his leather chair. He had never mentioned the near foreclosure to anyone in his entire life. He had spent that entire year bragging at the field club about a kitchen renovation, projecting an image of total financial stability while his foundation crumbled beneath him. Adelaide discovered your financial distress, Miss Pemberton continued. She utilized a private corporate holding company to purchase your distressed debt directly from First Connecticut Savings. She quietly became your primary creditor. The refinancing paperwork you signed in a panic contained a standard acceleration clause. My father stopped breathing. The color drained from his face, leaving his skin the shade of wet ash. He realized he had walked directly into a trap that had been 6 years in the making. You do not owe a bank, Richard, the lawyer clarified. You owe the estate of Adelaide Whitmore. The principal balance currently stands at $440,000. According to the terms she established upon her death, the entire debt is now callable. It is payable in full immediately. The physical collapse of my father was extraordinary to witness. His broad shoulders slumped forward. His chest caved inward. For 13 years he had operated under the delusion that he was the undisputed king of his domain. In 10 seconds, Miss Pemberton had revealed that he was merely a tenant, and his landlord had finally arrived to collect the rent. Bennett did not flinch at our father's financial ruin. A narcissist lacks the capacity to feel empathy for another person's downfall, even their own parent. Bennett only saw an obstacle being removed from his path. With his father sidelined by crippling debt, Bennett assumed the remainder of the $60 million estate would default directly to him. He leaned forward across the mahogany table, his eyes gleaming with unrestrained greed. Fine, Bennett said, waving his hand dismissively in the direction of our father. Dad made some bad investments. That is unfortunate. Move on to the next section. Read my designated share. Miss Pemberton turned another parchment page. The crisp sound cut through my father's ragged, shallow breathing. To my grandson, Bennett Whitmore, she read, keeping her tone clinically detached. I leave a single cardboard box containing his high school participation trophies. They are currently stored in the attic of the backcountry estate. The room went absolutely silent. Bennett blinked. His brain failed to process the sentence. I leave him these plastic figurines, Miss Pemberton read, quoting Adelaide directly from the document. Because they represent the only honest awards he has ever earned in his life. They are a monument to his consistent mediocrity. Let them serve as a permanent reminder that taking credit for the work of others holds no value in the real world. The insult landed with the precision of a sniper round. It struck the very core of Bennett's fabricated identity. Adelaide had reached out from beyond the grave and stripped away his entire genius facade. She had reduced the flashy portfolio strategist down to the lazy, cheating teenager he truly was. Bennett sprang up from his chair. His palms struck the mahogany table with a loud, sharp crack. This is a joke, he shouted, his voice echoing off the frosted glass walls of the conference room. Where is the money? She was worth $60 million in commercial real estate alone. Where is the liquid capital? Charlotte shrank back in her seat. Her oversized sunglasses slipped down the bridge of her nose. The reality of their impending poverty was crashing into her in real time. She looked around the room like a trapped animal, calculating the fastest available exit route. Miss Pemberton did not flinch at his outburst. She ignored his shouting entirely. She turned her head, adjusted her wire-rimmed glasses, and locked her gaze directly on me. The entirety of the estate, the lawyer read, her voice ringing with absolute authority, including all commercial real estate portfolios, all liquid capital accounts, all offshore holdings, and all controlling corporate interests, has been placed into an irrevocable trust. An irrevocable trust is a bulletproof financial fortress. It bypasses probate court entirely. It cannot be altered, contested, or dismantled by angry relatives. It is an ironclad transfer of power. The sole beneficiary, Miss Pemberton stated, and the sole executor of the Adelaide Whitmore Trust, is Eleanor Whitmore. Charlotte actually gasped. Her manicured hand flew to her mouth to muffle the sound. She dropped her phone onto the table. The screen glowed with the high-end Hamptons real estate listing she had been browsing just minutes earlier. The listing she would never afford. She looked at Bennett, her eyes wide with a confusing mixture of horror and sudden intense revulsion. She was looking at a dead man walking. I sat perfectly still. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I let the magnitude of the transfer settle over the room. I was no longer the invisible scapegoat hiding inside the old Greenwich Colonial. I was the executor of a $60 million empire. More importantly, I was the legal holder of my father's debt. I was their creditor. The power dynamic had flipped permanently. Bennett turned his head slowly toward me. The arrogant portfolio strategist vanished completely. The panicked, cornered teenager from the old Greenwich living room returned. His face flushed a deep, mottled purple. The veins in his neck strained against the collar of his expensive silk shirt. He pointed a shaking finger at me, deploying the exact same tactic he had used 13 years earlier. When backed into a corner, he reverted to the lie. "This is fraud," Bennett screamed. Spit flew from his lips. "You manipulated a dying woman. You spent years whispering poison into her ear while she was old and sick. You stole my inheritance." He paced a tight circle behind his chair. His breathing was ragged and shallow. He was losing control of the narrative, and it was tearing him apart from the inside out. "I am suing this estate," he threatened, pointing at Miss Pemberton, then back at me. "I am hiring the best litigators in Manhattan. I will tie this trust up in court for the next decade. I am going to expose you as a manipulative psychopath, Eleanor. I am taking everything. You hear me? Every single dollar." My father sat paralyzed in the head chair, crushed under the weight of his unpayable mortgage. My mother wept silently into her hands, mourning the loss of her unearned luxury. Bennett stood panting, an empty king demanding a crown that no longer existed. I did not yell back. I did not defend my character. Explaining the truth to a predator is a waste of oxygen. I looked at the brother who had cast me into a freezing ice storm to hide his own incompetence. I watched his fragile, pathetic ego fracture under the weight of undeniable reality. He truly believed he could threaten me with a lawsuit. He truly believed his bluster could save him. I unclasped my hands. I reached out and rested my fingertips on the edge of the thick manila folder sitting in front of me. I looked Bennett directly in the eyes. The silence in the room stretched until it felt like a physical weight pressing down on every shoulder. Then, using just 2 fingers, I slowly slid the manila folder across the smooth mahogany surface. The heavy manila folder stopped exactly in the center of the long mahogany table. The friction of the thick paper against the polished wood produced a soft, final scratching sound. It was the only noise in the room. Bennett stared down at the closed cover. The veins in his neck were still visibly pulsing from his screaming fit moments earlier, but his posture had frozen completely. "You cannot sue anyone, Bennett," I said. My voice remained perfectly level, filling the dead air of the conference room. I did not need to raise my volume. The truth carries its own acoustic weight. He blinked, trying to maintain his glare, but the foundation of his arrogance was visibly fracturing. In the American legal system, initiating a lawsuit regarding an estate opens the plaintiff's own financial history to a discovery process. You cannot claim financial damages without proving your current financial status. You have to open your books to the court under penalty of perjury. Bennett's jaw tightened. The threat of a lawsuit was his default defense mechanism, a bluff he used to bully clients and intimidate competitors. He had expected me to cower at the prospect of expensive litigation. He had not expected me to invite the scrutiny. As the executor of the Adelaide Whitmore estate, I continued keeping my hands folded calmly on the table. I have a fiduciary duty to evaluate the legitimacy of any potential claimants. Adelaide anticipated your threats. 6 months ago, she retained my forensic accounting firm to conduct a comprehensive audit on your portfolio management company. The remaining color drained from Bennett's face. The rage that had fueled his outburst vanished, replaced instantly by sheer, paralyzing terror. He understood exactly what my job title meant. He knew I dismantled financial illusions for a living. He knew I was trained to find the hidden ledgers he had assumed were buried forever. I did not just review your public filings, I explained, walking him through his own execution step by step. I traced the underlying bank records through Adelaide's legal trust. I mapped your incoming client deposits against your outgoing lifestyle expenses. I found the shadow ledger you disguised as a secondary consulting subsidiary. Bennett opened his mouth to speak. No sound came out. He looked like a man standing on a trapdoor, waiting for the lever to pull. You have been operating an unregistered investment pool, Bennett, I said clearly, articulating each word so there could be no misunderstanding. It is a textbook Ponzi scheme. You do not trade equities. You do not hold municipal bonds. You simply take fresh capital from new clients and use it to pay artificial dividends to your older clients. Charlotte pushed her chair back from the table. The legs scraped harshly against the hardwood floor. She stared at her husband as if he had just mutated into a stranger. Her oversized sunglasses lay abandoned next to her cell phone. The luxury runway she thought she had been walking down had just dissolved into a sheer cliff. The real tragedy is who you chose to target, I said, shifting my gaze from Bennett to my father. You took $850,000 from Richard and Margaret. You convinced them to empty their retirement accounts and hand you the entire balance. You promised them a guaranteed 14% return. My father jerked his head up. His eyes darted between me and Bennett. He was already reeling from the revelation of his own $440,000 debt to the estate. Now he was being told that his primary remaining asset, his entire life savings, was gone. Instead of investing their money, I stated, locking my eyes back on Bennett, you used their retirement funds to pay fabricated dividends to your country club friends. You used their nest egg to lease your Maserati, to charter sailboats out of Newport, to purchase Charlotte's Hermes collection. He said it was character building. 3 weeks later, a newer, sleeker Audi was parked in our circular driveway. My father took out a home equity line of credit to finance it. Now compare that to my own sophomore year. I spent 4 punishing months preparing for the New England Regional Science Olympiad. I stayed up until 2 in the morning every single night, building a working model of a hydroelectric turbine in our basement. I taught myself fluid dynamics from textbooks I borrowed from the public library. I wanted to be seen. I genuinely believed that a regional victory might finally force my parents to acknowledge that I existed. I won the gold medal. I beat hundreds of students from the most expensive private academies in New England. The judges handed me a heavy crystal trophy engraved with my name. I carried it carefully to the car, my heart pounding with disbelief and pride. I climbed into the passenger seat next to my mother. She gripped the steering wheel and exhaled a long, irritated sigh. She told me the drive to Boston had consumed her entire Saturday. She complained that she had missed her standing tennis lesson at the club. She informed me that my extracurricular obsessions were becoming a serious inconvenience for the family schedule. When we walked through the front door of the Colonial, my father was watching a Yankees game in the den. He never looked up from the television. My mother told me to take the trophy upstairs immediately so it would not clutter the formal living room. I carried the heavy crystal up to my bedroom. I placed it on the windowsill. I sat on the edge of my twin bed and stared at it for a very long time. I learned a crucial lesson that afternoon. In our house, my victories were inconveniences. My achievements were invisible. I made a quiet decision. I stopped trying to impress them. I started planning my exit strategy. I needed money. Advanced placement exams for biology and statistics cost nearly $200 each. When I handed the registration forms to my father, he slid them right back across the kitchen island. He said spending college credit money on a daughter was a poor financial investment. He said I would most likely marry a stockbroker anyway. I did not argue. I walked out of the house and applied for a job at a clam shack down by the marina. They hired me as a prep cook and dishwasher. For the next year, my life smelled like fryer grease, lemon wedges, and industrial dish soap. I worked 5 shifts a week. I hauled heavy tubs of dirty plates, scrubbed shellfish residue from steel pots, and counted my tips in the cramped employee bathroom, stacking quarters and crumpled bills into small piles. I hid my textbooks behind the cash register. During slow afternoons, I taught myself the principles of double-entry bookkeeping. I found enormous comfort in the cold logic of numbers. Numbers never played favorites. Balance sheets never lied to your face. Every dollar that came in had to be matched by a dollar going out. If something was missing, there was always a paper trail leading directly to the thief. I trained my brain to hunt for discrepancies. I did not realize it then, but that clam shack was my first classroom in forensic accounting. Bennett noticed my growing savings. He always noticed when someone close to him possessed something he wanted. He was not just favored by my parents. He was a predator in his own home. He understood the limits of his power, and he tested those limits constantly. The full reality of his cruelty became impossible to ignore on a quiet Sunday evening. My mother left her Coach handbag on the entryway console table. Bennett needed cash for a weekend trip to Block Island. I was walking down the hallway from the laundry room. I stopped. I watched my brother slide his fingers into her wallet. He pulled out a crisp $100 bill. He heard my footsteps on the hardwood floor. He turned his head. He looked directly at me. He did not flinch. He did not put the money back. He simply smiled, folded the bill into his pocket, and strolled into the kitchen to grab a soda. 20 minutes later, the house erupted. My mother stormed through the front hall, demanding to know where her cash had vanished. Bennett leaned against the marble kitchen counter, calmly sipping his Coke. He looked at our mother with wide, innocent blue eyes. He said he had noticed me lingering near the entryway just minutes earlier. He suggested, with practiced concern in his voice, that I might have needed extra money for my upcoming exam fees. My mother turned to me. Her face hardened into stone. She did not ask for my version of events. She did not search my pockets or my room. She simply pronounced the verdict. She informed me that I was grounded for 6 full weeks. She announced that my next 4 paychecks from the clam shack would be handed directly to her to compensate for the stolen bill. I stood in the hallway, my jaw locked so tight my molars ached. To maintain the illusion that you were a successful executive. That is a lie, Bennett choked out. His voice was weak and hollow, stripped of every ounce of its former bravado. It was the exact same tone he had used when he framed me for stealing the calculus exam 13 years earlier. But this time, he was not performing for a gullible audience in a suburban living room. He was facing a certified fraud examiner inside a Manhattan legal fortress. You are currently operating at a $3.2 million deficit, I replied, tapping the cover of the folder with one finger. The math is irrefutable. You do not have a business, Bennett. You have a federal crime. My father reached out with shaking hands and grabbed the manila folder. He yanked it toward his chest and flipped the cover open. He was a man who had made a lifetime of poor financial decisions, but he still knew how to read a highlighted bank statement. His eyes darted frantically across the pages. He saw the balance sheets my firm had reconstructed. He saw the highlighted wire transfers. Most importantly, he saw his own routing numbers. He stared at the transaction log showing the $850,000 he had personally wired to Bennett's firm. He traced the line across the page to see exactly where his money had landed. It had not gone into a high-yield mutual fund. It had gone directly into Bennett's personal checking account. Just 4 days before Bennett had purchased Charlotte's 3-carat anniversary diamond. The undeniable proof of his golden son's fraud was laid out in black ink across the highlighted spreadsheet. The boy he had worshipped, the son he had sacrificed my childhood to protect, had robbed him completely blind. My father dropped the papers back onto the mahogany surface. His hands fell limply to his lap. He looked at Bennett. The expression on my father's face was a complex, devastating mixture of betrayal, horror, and dawning realization. He finally saw the parasite he had created. He saw the monster he had personally fed with my innocence for 15 long years. My mother stared at the scattered documents. She did not understand the intricate mechanics of a Ponzi scheme, but she understood the tone of the room. She understood the number 850,000. Bennett, my mother whispered. Her voice trembled, completely lacking its usual maternal warmth. Is this true? Did you take our retirement money? The silence that followed her question was the loudest sound I have ever heard in my life. The golden boy had no charm left to deploy. He had no lies left to spin. The evidence was sitting right in front of his victims. Bennett could not look at her. He could not look at our father. He stared down at his expensive Italian shoes. Sweat beaded on his forehead and dripped down the side of his face, soaking into the collar of his custom-tailored shirt. He looked small, pathetic, and entirely broken. The golden child. The boy whose fake tears had once gotten me thrown into a freezing ice storm was utterly destroyed by numbers printed on a single page. The suburban facade had finally, irrevocably collapsed. The room shifted into a new and dangerous phase of grief. The shock was beginning to wear off, making way for the desperate panic of survival. My parents were now facing total financial ruin. They owed Adelaide's estate $440,000, and their entire remaining net worth had been stolen by their favorite child. They had no home equity. They had no savings. They had no golden parachute. They were drowning. And the only person in the room holding a life raft was the daughter they had discarded 13 years earlier. My father slowly lifted his head. He looked away from the shattered remains of his son and turned his gaze toward me. The arrogance was completely gone. The patriarchal authority was dead. His eyes were wide, desperate, and filled with a frantic, calculating terror. He was looking at the executor of a $60 million trust. He was looking at his only remaining exit strategy. He opened his mouth, preparing to pivot his loyalty in real time to save his own skin. My father released his grip on the audit file. The heavy paper spilled across the polished mahogany, fanning out like a deck of marked cards. His hands remained suspended in the air above the table. A tremor started in his fingertips and traveled rapidly up his forearms, shaking his wrists with a frantic, uncontrollable rhythm. I recognized that specific tremor. I had seen it 13 years earlier in a sterile trauma ward, when Adelaide had cornered him with the threat of corporate litigation. Back then he had shaken from the fear of losing his pristine suburban facade. Today he shook because the facade had just burned completely to the ground, taking his entire future with it. He slowly turned his head away from the damning bank statements and looked at his preferred heir. This was the boy he had shielded from every consequence. This was the teenager he had bought a new Audi for after a reckless drag race. This was the son he had sacrificed my entire childhood to protect. My father stared at Bennett and finally, fully saw the empty void hiding behind the designer suit. "You stole from us," my father said. His voice was hollow, stripped of its usual booming bass. It sounded like a dry branch snapping underfoot in winter. "You took everything we had." He waited for a response. He waited for the golden child to produce a miraculous excuse, to flash a winning smile, to explain how this was all a massive misunderstanding. But Bennett had no charm left to deploy. He kept his eyes locked on the polished floorboards, his shoulders hunched inward. The silence confirmed the theft. My mother let out a low, keening sound of pure grief. It was a visceral noise that seemed to originate from the very bottom of her lungs. She reached her hand out, intending to touch Bennett's sleeve, but her fingers stopped inches from the fabric. She hovered there, unable to make physical contact with the stranger wearing her son's face. Her delusion was shattering in real time. The brilliant portfolio strategist she had bragged about at the country club was a phantom. The reality was a common thief who had drained her retirement accounts to lease sports cars. While my parents descended into shock, Charlotte executed a rapid, cold calculation. She did not weep. She did not offer words of comfort. She was a survivalist operating in a high-rent zip code, and she recognized a sinking ship the moment the hull breached. She assessed the net worth in the room and realized her husband's column currently equaled a federal prison sentence. Charlotte stood up. The wooden legs of her chair scraped harshly against the hardwood floor. She reached down and picked up her crocodile Hermes Birkin, sliding the gold chain strap over her shoulder with practiced elegance. She looked down at Bennett. Her expression contained zero heartbreak. Her eyes held the specific icy disgust reserved for a catastrophic financial investment gone wrong. "I am calling my divorce attorney," Charlotte stated. She did not wait for an argument. She turned on her heel and walked toward the exit. The sharp click of her stilettos echoed off the frosted glass walls, measuring out the final seconds of Bennett's marriage. She pulled the heavy conference room door open and stepped into the hallway. The door swung shut behind her, sealing the room. Bennett's isolation was now physical, legal, and absolute. The sound of the door closing triggered a physical collapse inside my brother. The last remaining pillar of his false reality gave way. Bennett buried his face in his hands. His breathing turned jagged and erratic. He pulled in air in short, desperate gasps, his chest heaving under the expensive silk of his shirt. He was hyperventilating. The sheer terror of federal indictment, public humiliation, and total poverty crashed over him all at once. He rocked slightly in his chair. A broken king mourning a stolen crown. I watched the spectacle unfold from the opposite side of the table. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting lightly in my lap. My father watched his daughter-in-law walk out. He watched his son break down into a hyperventilating mess. He realized his bloodline kingdom was officially dead. The legacy he had tried to construct through his male heir was a toxic ruin. Survival instinct is a powerful, blinding force. It overrides pride, logic, and shame. My father pivoted his head and locked his gaze onto me. The transition was jarring. He stripped away decades of disdain and patriarchal authority, replacing them with a frantic, begging desperation. He leaned his torso across the mahogany table, stretching his hands toward me as if trying to bridge the massive chasm he had personally created. "Eleanor, please," my father pleaded. His voice cracked, rising in pitch. "You have to help us. You have $60 million in that trust. You possess the capital to fix this right now." He gestured wildly toward the scattered audit pages. "You can pay off his investors," my father urged, his eyes wide with panic. "You can make them whole before they report him to the federal authorities. You can keep your brother out of prison." He did not stop there. The audacity of his survival instinct pushed him further. "And the estate," he continued, pointing at the legal binder still resting in front of Miss Pemberton. "You are the sole executor. You control the holding company that owns my debt. You can forgive my mortgage. You can wipe out the $440,000. We can start over." He paused, searching my face for any sign of compliance. He played his final desperate card. "We are your parents, Eleanor," he whispered, his eyes filling with tears. "We are family." It was the ultimate test of my armor. The people who had thrown me away like a broken appliance were now begging me for salvation. They were asking me to use the reward Adelaide had given me to buy their freedom. They wanted me to shield them from the consequences of their own choices, just like they had shielded Bennett his entire life. I looked at my mother, who was sobbing uncontrollably into her embroidered handkerchief, mourning a retirement she would never enjoy. I looked at my brother, sweating and gasping for air, facing the undeniable reality of a federal prison cell. I looked at my father, stripped of all his arrogant power, reduced to begging the daughter he had once called a defective nothing. I turned my focus inward. I conducted a silent inventory of my emotional temperature. For 15 years, I had dreamed about this exact scenario. During late-night study sessions in high school, I had imagined the fury I would unleash upon them. While walking through the freezing ice storm along Shore Road, I had imagined the righteous anger I would hurl at their faces. I searched my chest for that anger. I searched for the lingering resentment. It was gone. I searched for a trace of pity. I wondered if the sight of my elderly parents facing destitution would trigger a dormant instinct to protect them. I wondered if the sight of my brother hyperventilating would make me feel a shred of sibling loyalty. That was gone too. I felt nothing. There was no rage. There was no sorrow. There was no vindictive thrill or cruel satisfaction. There was only a vast, clear expanse of profound indifference. It was the most liberating sensation I had ever experienced. The heavy, suffocating chain that had tied my identity to their approval simply dissolved. I realized I was looking at three strangers. Their panic did not belong to me. Their debt did not belong to me. Their impending legal destruction was their own distinct property, and I had no interest in claiming any portion of it. Adelaide had taught me how to build a fortress. Sitting in that conference room, I finally understood the true purpose of the walls. The walls were not built to keep the enemy out. The walls were built to keep my peace in. I took a slow, steady breath. The air in the room felt crisp and clean. I prepared to deliver the final verdict. I placed my palms flat on the mahogany table. I pushed my chair back. The wooden legs scraped against the hardwood floor with a sharp, grating sound that effectively silenced the frantic breathing of the three broken people sitting across from me. I stood up. I reached for the center button of my tailored navy suit jacket and fastened it. It was a simple, mundane motion. But in that sterile corporate environment, it signaled the end of the trial. The verdict was rendered. The execution was complete. I reached down and grasped the leather handle of my briefcase. I did not rush my movements. I let every second of my impending departure carry maximum weight. I looked down at Richard Whitmore. He was still leaning his torso across the polished table, his hand outstretched, his palm facing upward in a pathetic gesture of supplication. The arrogant patriarch who used to dictate reality with an iron fist was gone. In his place sat a desperate, aging man drowning in an ocean of unpayable debt. 13 years ago, I said. My voice remained remarkably steady. It carried the flat, even cadence of a news anchor reading a minor headline. The wind was howling off Long Island Sound. The rain was freezing. The governor had declared a coastal emergency and shut down the rail lines. You stood in the warm, dry entryway of your comfortable colonial. You looked me directly in the eye, and you told me you would not raise a defective daughter in your house. His outstretched hand flinched. His fingers curled inward. The memory was a ghost he had tried to bury beneath a decade of country club memberships and kitchen renovations. But I was dragging it into the harsh fluorescent light of the present. You made a choice that night, I continued, my gaze fixed firmly on his terrified face. You chose the illusion of perfection over the survival of your own child. You chose to protect a liar. I am simply honoring the boundary you drew. You demanded my absence. You enforced it with a deadbolt. I am making my choice today to respect your original wish. He shook his head frantically, rejecting the mirror I held up to his history. Eleanor, you cannot do this, he begged. His voice dropped into a raspy, desperate whisper. You cannot just walk out that door and leave us with nothing. I shifted my gaze from him to the hyperventilating mess sitting 2 chairs down. Bennett was trembling. His face was buried in his hands. His expensive silk shirt was damp with cold sweat. I am not leaving you with nothing, I replied. My tone lacked malice. It lacked sympathy. It was the pure, unadulterated sound of indifference. I am leaving you with the son you chose. You bought him. You financed his facade. You sacrificed my childhood to shield his ego. He is your legacy. Now you get to keep him. I turned my attention briefly to Margaret. She had stopped sobbing into her embroidered handkerchief. She was staring at me with a hollow, terrified expression. Her entire identity had been forged in the crucible of Fairfield County status. Her life consisted of bragging about her golden son at lunches and hosting holiday parties in a colonial she no longer owned. She was finally realizing that weaponized silence offered no shelter from a financial hurricane. She would have to face those same social circles with a bankrupt husband and an imprisoned son. I gave her a single, definitive nod, closing the book on our relationship forever. I pivoted away from my biological family and looked toward the head of the table. Miss Pemberton sat with her hands folded neatly over the heavy legal binder. She was watching the exchange with pristine professional detachment, a silent guardian of Adelaide's final wishes. Miss Pemberton, I said, shifting my tone back to pure business. Please proceed with the compliance protocols outlined in the secondary addendum of the trust. The lawyer nodded once and tapped a silver pen against her legal pad. Acknowledged, she replied. Forward the complete forensic audit files to the Securities and Exchange Commission immediately, I instructed. Ensure the United States Attorney for the Southern District of New York receives the secondary copies of all wire transfers and bank statements. Adelaide's instructions were explicit regarding regulatory compliance. We will not harbor liability for his shadow ledgers. The acronym struck Bennett's nervous system like a physical blow. The SEC. The U.S. Attorney. These were not angry relatives he could charm or manipulate. These were federal entities possessing subpoena power, armed investigators, and federal prison cells. They did not care about his preparatory school background or his leased Maserati. They cared only about wire fraud. Bennett let out a choked, guttural sob. The sound tore from his throat like ripping fabric. His hands gripped his own hair. He was no longer a polished portfolio strategist commanding a room. He was a cornered animal realizing the steel trap had permanently snapped shut over his leg. He knew his bank accounts would be frozen before sunset. He knew federal agents would arrive at his rented Stamford office by morning with cardboard boxes to seize his hard drives. I turned my back on the mahogany table. I did not wait for further arguments. I did not wait for apologies. Apologies issued under the imminent threat of poverty and incarceration are just manipulative transactions disguised as remorse. They hold zero value. I walked toward the heavy frosted glass doors. My low heels clicked rhythmically against the hardwood floor. Each step I took felt lighter than the last. I pushed through the heavy exit and stepped into the quiet, carpeted hallway of the law firm. Behind me, the muffled sounds of raw panic erupted inside the conference room. My father was shouting my name. Bennett was weeping openly. The noise was chaotic, desperate, and entirely detached from my reality. I did not pause to decipher their frantic words. I walked briskly to the elevator bank and pressed the call button. The brushed steel doors slid open instantly. I stepped inside the empty cab and turned around to face the hallway. Through the closing gap in the doors, I saw the frosted glass wall of Miss Pemberton's office. I heard the faint, muffled echo of my father yelling, begging the lawyer to halt the regulatory filing. Then the heavy doors slid together with a soft musical chime, sealing shut. The descending mechanism engaged, pulling the elevator smoothly down the shaft. I stood alone in the descending cab. The silence was profound. I closed my eyes and took a deep, deliberate breath. I drew the air deep into the bottom of my lungs. For the first time in my entire existence, the oxygen felt entirely clean. It was untainted by guilt. It was unburdened by obligation. It was devoid of the suffocating fear that had defined my early years. The phantom weight I had carried since childhood, the heavy stone of being the designated scapegoat, dissolved into the brushed steel walls of the elevator shaft. The doors opened at the marble lobby. I walked past the security desk, nodded to the guard, and pushed through the revolving glass doors. I stepped out onto the crowded sidewalk of Park Avenue. The crisp autumn afternoon greeted me with a rush of cold, bracing air. The sun reflected brightly off the tall glass towers lining the avenue. Yellow taxis hummed past in tight formation. Pedestrians rushed by me, holding coffee cups and briefcases, hurrying toward their own destinations, living their own complicated lives. I adjusted my grip on my briefcase and merged into the moving crowd. I was a 28-year-old woman walking into the rest of her life. Finally and irrevocably, free from the ghosts of old Greenwich. 6 months evaporated into the cold winter air of a new year. The fallout from the conference room did not unfold like a dramatic television movie. It unfolded like a corporate bankruptcy. It was swift, procedural, and entirely devoid of emotion. The Securities and Exchange Commission moves at its own deliberate pace. But when handed a perfectly assembled forensic audit, their gears turn with terrifying efficiency. They did not call Bennett to ask for an explanation. They did not offer him a polite sit-down interview. 3 weeks after the will reading, unmarked sedans pulled up to his rented Stamford office. Federal agents wearing dark windbreakers walked through the front doors holding signed warrants. They instructed his receptionist to step away from her computer. They disconnected his servers, seized his hard drives, and carried out endless stacks of cardboard banker boxes containing his fabricated client portfolios. Bennett was indicted on 26 counts of federal wire fraud, securities fraud, and money laundering. The local news stations picked up the story the following morning. They broadcast footage of the Golden Child walking out of the federal courthouse in Lower Manhattan wearing handcuffs. His custom-tailored suit wrinkled. His face shielded behind a manila envelope. The wealthy country club friends who had trusted his confident smile suddenly realized their portfolios were empty shells. The resulting civil lawsuits flooded the docket. The most devastating consequence of the federal indictment fell squarely onto the shoulders of Richard and Margaret. When the government raids a Ponzi scheme, They immediately freeze every connected bank account. They initiate asset forfeiture protocols to prepare for victim restitution. My parents had wired their entire life savings directly into Bennett's fraudulent structure. Therefore, their retirement fund was no longer their private property. It was tagged as federal evidence. They could not withdraw a single dollar. They could not hire a lawyer to petition for its return because the money itself was classified as the proceeds of a crime. Their $850,000 nest egg evaporated into a locked federal depository. They were left holding nothing but checking accounts containing a few $100s. Without their savings, the fragile financial structure supporting the old Greenwich Colonial collapsed instantly. The default notices triggered exactly 30 days after they missed their first callable debt payment to the Adelaide Whitmore Trust. As the legal executor of that trust, I did not personally call my father to demand the money. I let the bureaucratic machinery handle the eviction. My legal counsel sent the formal 90-day notice of foreclosure via certified mail. The postal tracking receipt showed my father's signature, jagged and erratic. He knew the end had arrived. He did not attempt to fight the proceedings. He had zero capital to mount a legal defense. The actual eviction day arrived on a rainy Tuesday morning in March. I did not attend. I had no desire to stand on the sidewalk and watch them carry their belongings out the front door. The Fairfield County Sheriff arrived to enforce the court order. A state-appointed locksmith changed the brass deadbolt on the heavy oak door. My father packed 30 years of assumed superiority into a rented moving truck. He and my mother loaded up the remnants of their suburban illusion. They drove away from the manicured lawns and the excellent school district, leaving behind the Colonial where they had once cast their 15-year-old daughter into an ice storm. The poetic symmetry of the foreclosure was not lost on me. I owned the house they had thrown me out of, but I felt no desire to cross that threshold ever again. I instructed my real estate broker to list the old Greenwich property the very next day. I priced it fairly, targeting young families looking to enter the school district. It sold within 9 days. The buyers were a pediatric oncologist and a high school music teacher with 3 young sons. They were hardworking, genuine people who truly deserved a waterfront Colonial. They sent me a polite handwritten note thanking me for a smooth transaction. They attached a photograph of their sons painting over the heavy mahogany wainscoting in the formal dining room, replacing it with a bright, cheerful pale blue. I looked at the photograph on my desk and smiled. The ghost of my childhood was officially painted over. A healthy family was going to fill those rooms with actual warmth rather than weaponized silence. Richard and Margaret relocated to a cramped 2-bedroom apartment in a significantly less desirable town an hour north of their former kingdom. The building featured thin walls, peeling exterior paint, and a view of a busy commercial highway. They lost their country club memberships. They lost their dinner party invitations. Their former friends stopped returning their phone calls, eager to distance themselves from the parents of a convicted federal felon. My parents were reduced to surviving strictly on their monthly Social Security distributions. They had to clip grocery coupons. They had to budget their heating bills. They were forced to inhabit the exact reality of the working-class lifestyle they had spent decades mocking. The silence of their new existence must be deafening. They have no golden child to brag about, no grand Colonial to decorate, and no scapegoat left to absorb their misery. They are trapped inside a tiny apartment with nothing but the consequences of their own choices. Bennett did not go to trial. A trial would have required him to sit in a federal courtroom and face the people he robbed. It would have required him to listen to federal prosecutors dismantle his genius identity piece by piece. His fragile ego could not withstand public cross-examination. He accepted a global plea deal. He confessed to 4 counts of wire fraud and 2 counts of securities fraud in exchange for a lighter sentence. The judge ordered him to serve 6 years in a minimum security federal penitentiary in upstate New York, followed by 4 years of supervised release and mandated financial restitution he will never realistically repay. Charlotte finalized their divorce while he was awaiting transfer. She took her Hermes bags, reverted to her maiden name, and moved to Palm Beach, severing all ties to the Whitmore family disaster. The reality of a prison cell strips a man of his tailored suits and his Patek Philippe watches. It places him in a beige uniform. It assigns him a 6-digit number. For a narcissist, the loss of visual status is a fate worse than physical death. A month ago, my receptionist walked into my office and placed a plain white envelope on my desk. The return address, printed in the top corner, belonged to the Federal Correctional Institution in Otisville, New York. The handwriting was unmistakable. It was Bennett's jagged, sloping print. I picked up the envelope. It felt incredibly light. I slid a brass letter opener under the flap and pulled out a single sheet of cheap-lined notebook paper. I expected a genuine apology. A small part of my mind assumed that losing his freedom might have sparked a moment of brutal self-reflection. I was wrong. The letter was a dense, rambling monologue of deferred accountability. The ink was smudged in several places. He wrote about the poor quality of the cafeteria food. He complained about the lack of air conditioning in his cell block. He dedicated an entire paragraph to explaining how market conditions had forced his hand. He claimed his earliest investors had pressured him into taking risks. He insisted his intentions had been pure, and he was simply misunderstood by federal regulators. He did not mention the $850,000 he had stolen from our parents. He did not mention the yacht deposit. He did not mention the 13 years he had spent letting me absorb the blame for his failures. The word sorry did not appear a single time on the page. The letter was just a desperate attempt to locate a new audience for his victim narrative. I read the first half of the page. My eyes skimmed the familiar, hollow excuses. I did not feel a spike of anger. I did not feel a pang of sorrow for the boy in the beige jumpsuit. I stopped reading mid-sentence. I folded the cheap notebook paper neatly in half. I turned my swivel chair toward the heavy-duty paper shredder sitting beside my filing cabinet. I fed the envelope and the letter into the narrow slot. The steel blades whirred to life, grabbing the paper and grinding it down into thousands of illegible white ribbons. I turned back to my desk, opened a spreadsheet for a new corporate client, and went back to work. I do not follow their lives anymore. I do not check public prison registries to monitor Bennett's sentence. I do not drive past the cramped apartment building where my parents clip their coupons. They exist in a separate universe. They are strangers to me now, bound only by a biological technicality I have legally and emotionally severed. Society often pushes the narrative that family requires unconditional forgiveness. People say you must always throw a lifeline to your own blood. But my career in fraud investigation has taught me a very different truth. The people who demand your loyalty the loudest are usually the exact same people who never earned a single drop of it. They demand blind devotion to cover their own deficits. Forgiveness is a fine concept. Releasing resentment is necessary for your own physical health. But forgiveness does not require reconciliation. You can forgive a predator for your own peace of mind without inviting them back into your house. You do not have to buy them a life raft when they deliberately sink their own ship. Sometimes the healthiest choice you can make is to simply stand on the shore, watch the water swallow the wreckage, and walk away. I am 28 years old now. The calendar recently turned, marking a full decade and a half since that freezing night on Shore Road. Time offers a specific, purifying kind of clarity. I sit at the heavy walnut desk in the main study of the Greenwich estate. This house belongs to me now, completely free of any encumbrances. It is not just a collection of expensive stone and imported glass. It is a physical fortress built on undeniable truth. Every spring I hire a dedicated team of local landscapers. I instruct them to plant deep blue hydrangeas along the winding driveway and around the perimeter of the stone terrace. They were Adelaide's favorite flower. They bloom with a fierce, vibrant resilience, returning every single year, regardless of how harsh the winter frost bites the soil. I enjoy looking at them through my office window while I drink my morning coffee. They serve as a quiet, daily reminder that enduring a brutal cold season does not prevent a beautiful, lasting resurgence. I run my own financial investigation firm now. I employ a team of 36 brilliant, meticulous analysts. We specialize in dismantling the exact type of corporate illusions my brother once tried to build. We hunt shadow ledgers, expose offshore tax havens, and track the quiet movements of stolen capital across international borders. My daily life is structured, calm, and immensely rewarding. I kept the people who mattered. I built a chosen family composed of dedicated colleagues, wise mentors, and loyal friends who value raw truth over polite comfort. I let the trash take itself out. Occasionally, the history of my biological family surfaces in polite conversation. When you achieve a certain level of professional visibility, people grow naturally curious about your background. Colleagues or acquaintances sometimes learn scattered fragments of the story. They ask the inevitable questions society conditions us to ask regarding family loyalty. They lean in across restaurant tables, lower their voices to a sympathetic whisper, and ask if I feel any lingering regret. They wonder if the holiday seasons feel empty without my parents. They ask if I experience any twinge of guilt for watching my elderly father and mother lose their comfortable home, their retirement savings, and their polished social standing, knowing I possess the liquid capital to rescue them with a single, effortless bank transfer. My answer is always a swift, unwavering negative. I feel zero guilt. Guilt implies that you have committed a wrong. It implies that you have caused unjustified harm. I did not destroy Richard and Margaret Whitmore. I did not bankrupt them. Their own boundless entitlement acted as the sole architect of their ruin. They chose to feed a parasite because the parasite shared their DNA and flattered their vanity. They willingly handed their entire life savings to a con artist. I did not push them off the cliff. I simply refused to stand at the bottom of the ravine and act as their landing pad. For 15 years, they had used me as a human shield to protect Bennett from the natural consequences of his actions. On the day of the will reading, I just stepped out of the way. Gravity handled the rest. If you are watching this video right now, I need you to listen very closely to this next part. I know you're out there. I know exactly what it feels like to be the designated scapegoat of your own bloodline. You are the one quietly absorbing the blame to keep the fragile household peace. You are the one bussing tables, studying late into the night, funding your own ambitions, working twice as hard to earn a fraction of the love effortlessly handed to the golden child. You analyze every word before you speak, terrified of triggering an unpredictable explosion. You carry the heavy, unjust burden of maintaining a family narrative that actively erases your worth. Society will tell you to compromise. Society will quote tired proverbs about blood being thicker than water. Relatives will tell you to turn the other cheek. To forgive. To keep showing up at the holiday dinner table. To endure the subtle insults and the overt disrespect. They will demand that you keep the secret. I am here to offer you a different set of rules. You do not owe toxic people your success. You do not owe them your hard-earned peace. You do not owe them a seat at the table you built with your own bare hands while they were busy trying to starve you. The biological coincidence of shared genetics is not a binding contract for lifelong abuse. When a narcissist realizes they can no longer control you, they will pivot. They will try to control how others perceive you. They will paint you as the villain of the story. They will smear your name to their friends, their neighbors, and extended relatives. Let them talk. Let them spin their fragile fictions. Their words hold zero currency in the real world. When they decide you are no longer a useful pawn, when they open the front door and throw you out into the freezing storm, let them lock the deadbolt. Do not pound your fists against the wetwood. Do not beg for readmission into a prison. Turn around and face the wind. It will be cold. It will be terrifying. The dark will feel endless. The rain will sting your skin. But while they are sitting inside their decaying house, rotting in their own false comfort, you are going to learn a vital, life-saving skill. You are going to learn how to walk through the rain. You will discover a deep reservoir of strength you never knew you possessed. You will forge your own armor out of the trauma they inflicted. Use the rejection as high-octane fuel. Let their dismissal become the catalyst for your total independence. Focus entirely on your education. Focus on your career. Focus on building a sanctuary where their chaos cannot reach you. Guard your boundaries with the unyielding vigilance of a sentry. Do not let them cross the moat once you pull up the drawbridge. You do not need to seek petty retaliation. You do not need to scheme or plot a grand theatrical downfall for your abusers. The universe has a remarkable, unhurried way of balancing the scales. Entitlement always carries the seed of its own destruction. Liars eventually drown in the tangled webs they weave. Your only job is to ensure that you are standing safely on high ground when the floodwaters finally rise. Let your unshakable success serve as the loudest revenge you ever take. Let your quiet, joyful existence stand as the ultimate defiance against the people who tried to break your spirit. They called you defective. They called you a nothing. They told you that you were a burden. They were wrong. You are not a burden. You are not collateral damage. You are not broken. You are the storm. Thank you for listening to my story today. I hope it brings you clarity, strength, and the courage to walk away from tables where respect is no longer being served. Take care of yourself. Guard your peace. And I will see you in the next story. I look out over the Greenwich estate as the afternoon sun casts long golden shadows across the stone terrace. The air is still. The hydrangeas Adelaide loved so much are in full bloom, their deep blue petals standing in stark defiance of the long winter we just endured. It is quiet here, but it is a rich, fulfilling quiet. It is the sound of a life built on solid ground, far away from the fragile, collapsing illusions of my past. When I think back to that freezing night on Shore Road, the memory feels like a scene from someone else's life. The 15-year-old girl who stood shivering in the dark, believing she was a burden, no longer exists. The storm washed her away. In her place, a woman forged in forensic truth and unyielding boundaries remains. Looking back at the wreckage of my biological family and the empire I chose to protect, I carry 5 distinct truths with me. I keep them anchored in my mind. A permanent ledger of survival. Biology is a genetic coincidence, not a contract for abuse. Blood does not make a family. Loyalty, consistency, and showing up when the sky falls. That is what makes a family. Adelaide proved that to me in a sterile trauma ward, and I prove it to myself every single day. Boundaries are shields, not weapons. They are not designed to punish toxic people. They are designed to protect your peace. When I walked out of that conference room on Park Avenue, I did not leave my parents and my brother to hurt them. I left them to save myself. You can forgive someone from a distance while keeping the deadbolt securely locked. Financial independence is the ultimate armor. Tears, arguments, and pleas for fairness hold zero currency against a predator. Capital, leverage, and information are the only languages an entitled mind understands. Building my own career and securing my own resources meant nobody could ever threaten me with homelessness again. You are not obligated to rescue people from their own consequences. My parents bankrupted themselves to feed Bennett's ego. Bennett built a federal crime out of pure, unchecked entitlement. Stepping out of the way and letting gravity take hold was not an act of cruelty. It was allowing accountability to finally do its job. Joy is the only revenge worth pursuing. I did not need to actively plot their downfall. I just needed to focus entirely on my own ascent. The universe balances the scales on its own time. Your only responsibility is to make sure you are standing on high ground when the floodwaters rise. I am 28 years old, and my ledger is perfectly balanced. I hold no debts to the past. I owe nothing to the ghosts of old Greenwich. If you are navigating your own storm right now, keep walking. The rain eventually stops. And the life you build on the other side will be more beautiful than you can currently imagine. Thank you for spending your time with me today. If my journey resonated with you, please subscribe to the channel. Hit the like button. And share your own experiences in the comments below. We are building a community of survivors here, and your voice matters. Keep your boundaries strong. Guard your peace. And I will see you in the next story. I wanted to scream the truth until the windows rattled. I wanted to empty my pockets and prove I did not have the money. But I knew the unwritten laws of a toxic household. When your family requires a designated scapegoat to maintain their shared fantasy, your innocence becomes an insult to their narrative. Fighting back only extends the punishment. I nodded silently. I pulled my tip money from the front pocket of my apron. A wrinkled 50 and several smaller bills. I handed it to her without a word. I turned around and walked up the stairs to my bedroom. Bennett watched me climb. He took another sip of his soda. He learned a dangerous lesson that night. He realized he could use me as a human shield for his own theft. He realized our parents would never question his integrity as long as I was standing in the room to absorb the blame. That quiet evening of stolen cash laid the foundation for the disaster that would end my childhood. The golden boy was beginning to crack under the weight of his own incompetence. Bennett was entering his senior year of high school. The pressure was building rapidly. My parents had been bragging at country club dinners for 2 years about the elite Ivy League university Bennett would be attending. They had ordered a custom decal for the rear window of his Audi. But Bennett was failing. He lacked the basic discipline to complete the actual coursework required for an honors diploma. He was bombing advanced calculus. The school administration was threatening to revoke his early admission status. The letters arrived in our mailbox in heavy cream envelopes. My father called the headmaster repeatedly, accusing the math department of grading bias against male students. But screaming at administrators could not change a transcript. Bennett was cornered, both academically and socially. His entire identity as the brilliant son was about to shatter publicly. A narcissist backed into a corner is the most dangerous creature on earth. He started prowling the upstairs hallway after midnight. He stopped sleeping. He needed a miracle to pass his calculus final and preserve his Ivy League acceptance. Or, failing a miracle, he needed a victim to absorb the blame for his collapse. The tension inside our colonial reached an unbearable peak during the final weeks of my sophomore spring. Bennett was a senior, and his carefully manufactured reality was splintering. My parents had spent the entire spring season showing off his acceptance letter to their neighbors. They had hung an embroidered school banner in the dining room. They had placed an alumni window cling on the back of his Audi. But that admission was conditional. It depended entirely on him maintaining a minimum grade point average, a requirement he was currently failing to meet. His specific poison was advanced calculus. Bennett could easily flirt with a young English teacher to bump up an essay grade. He could talk his way out of a tardy slip with a wink and a smile. But calculus offered no room for charisma. It was a subject governed by rigid mathematical truths. You either understood the chain rule or you did not. Bennett did not. By the second week of May, he was carrying a failing grade. If he bombed the final exam, he would fail the course, lose his honors diploma, and watch his Ivy League acceptance evaporate before graduation. I knew he was failing because I shared the same math teacher despite being 2 years younger. Mr. Donovan kept a paper grade book on his desk, and I sat in the front row carrying a perfect score. Bennett sat in the back, sleeping through lectures and bombing every weekly quiz. The contrast was a quiet festering wound in his ego. He needed a miracle to pass that final exam. Instead of studying, he chose sabotage. The incident happened on a slow Wednesday afternoon. The final bell had emptied most of the hallways. I had stayed late to organize files for the Model United Nations Club. I left my heavy canvas backpack on a wooden bench in the main corridor. It was a quiet, safe school district. Leaving your bag unattended for 20 minutes was completely normal. While I was filing documents, Bennett was executing his desperate plan. He had noticed that Mr. Donovan often left his classroom door unlocked during the last period of the day. Bennett slipped into the empty math classroom. He went straight to the teacher's desk. He opened drawers and shuffled through folders until he found his target. It was a manila envelope labeled Final Exam Masters, Do Not Photocopy. He grabbed the stolen papers, ready to walk out the door and secure his counterfeit future. Then the rattling sound of a janitor's cart echoed down the hallway. A custodian was approaching the classroom, humming a low tune to himself. Bennett panicked. He darted out the side exit into the main corridor, his heart slamming against his ribs, clutching the stolen exams against his chest. He could not risk being caught with the evidence. He scanned the hallway frantically. He spotted my canvas backpack sitting abandoned on the bench. He recognized the embroidered patches I had sewn onto the front flap. He did not hesitate. He unzipped the main compartment, shoved the manila envelope between my chemistry and history textbooks, zipped it back up, and walked briskly toward the parking lot. I returned to the bench 10 minutes later. I hoisted the bag onto my shoulder and walked home along the Marina Road. I had absolutely no idea I was carrying the weapon that would destroy my childhood. The trap snapped shut the following morning. I was sitting in second period English when the loudspeaker crackled overhead. The secretary requested my immediate presence in the principal's office. I walked down the polished linoleum corridor feeling nothing but mild curiosity. I was a straight-A student with an unblemished disciplinary record. I assumed they needed my help organizing a school assembly. I walked into the administrative suite and found the principal sitting behind his enormous oak desk. His expression was grave. Mr. Donovan stood beside him with his arms crossed, his face carved with disappointment. They asked me to place my backpack on the desk. They asked me to unzip the main compartment. I pulled the zipper open, completely confident that I had nothing to hide. The principal reached inside and removed the manila envelope. I stared at it. My brain refused to process what I was seeing. They opened the flap, revealing the original master copies of the calculus final exam. The principal asked me why I had stolen school property. I stammered. I denied it. I told them I had never seen that envelope in my entire life. They did not believe me. The physical evidence was sitting on the desk between us, surrounded by my own labeled notebooks. Within 15 minutes, they were on the phone with my parents. I sat in a plastic chair in the waiting area, my stomach twisting into a frozen knot. I was suspended pending a formal disciplinary hearing with the school board. My father drove to the school to collect me. He did not say a single word during the entire car ride home. His knuckles were bone white on the steering wheel. The silence in the cabin of the Mercedes was thick, toxic, and suffocating. We pulled into the circular driveway. We walked through the front door of our colonial. The formal living room had been staged like a courtroom. My mother sat on the edge of the cream sofa, wringing her hands, her face the color of paper. Bennett sat beside her. He was leaning forward, his face buried in his palms. The moment my father shut the heavy front door, the performance commenced. Bennett lifted his head. His eyes were red. Fat tears rolled down his cheeks in dramatic, theatrical waves. It was a stunning, Oscar-worthy performance of false grief. He pointed a trembling finger directly at me. I saw her do it. Bennett choked out, his voice fracturing on every syllable. I was walking past the math hallway yesterday afternoon. I saw Eleanor sneaking out of Mr. Donovan's classroom. I asked her what she was doing in there. She laughed at me. She said she wanted to steal the exam and frame me so I would lose my acceptance to Princeton. I stood frozen in the entryway. The audacity of the lie locked my lungs in place. Bennett looked up at my parents with wide, devastated eyes. She said she wanted to ruin my graduation because she is sick with jealousy. Bennett sobbed. She needs psychiatric help. Dad, she is unwell. The atmosphere in the living room shifted. I could physically feel reality warping as my parents inhaled the poison without a moment of resistance. That is a lie, I shouted, my voice ringing off the high ceilings. I stepped forward, turning to my father, desperate for basic logic to break through the spell. Dad, look at my report card. I have a perfect grade in calculus. I do not need a cheat sheet. Bennett is the one failing. Bennett is the one about to lose Princeton. He planted that envelope in my bag to save himself from his own laziness. It was airtight. It was undeniable. It was backed by transcripts and basic common sense. I waited for my parents to register the math. But logic carries no weight in a house built on delusion. My mother gasped. She wrapped both arms tightly around Bennett, shushing him gently, stroking his hair as though he were a frightened toddler. She glared at me over his shoulder, her eyes blazing with maternal outrage. How could you say such venomous things about your only brother? She whispered. He has loved you your entire life. I turned to my father, praying for one molecule of rational thought to survive. But reason had already left the room. My father stood beside the brick fireplace, his face hardening into a mask of pure cold fury. He did not see a terrified 15-year-old daughter pleading for her life. He saw a threat to his golden son. He saw an infection that needed to be excised from his perfect home. Outside, the sky had turned a bruised, unnatural shade of charcoal. The wind was rising, rattling the antique mullioned windows. A massive late-season ice storm was sliding down the Connecticut coastline. But the real storm had already broken inside our living room. My father took a slow step toward me, his fists clenching at his sides. I knew the trial had ended. The execution was about to begin. Outside our colonial in Old Greenwich, the sky had collapsed into a swirling charcoal mass. A historic late-spring ice storm was hammering the entire Connecticut shoreline, dragging sheets of freezing rain across the manicured lawns of the Gold Coast. The wind shrieked through the bare branches of the dogwood trees, snapping smaller limbs and sending them clattering against the slate roof. Ice was beginning to coat the cedar shake siding of the neighboring houses. But the dropping atmospheric pressure outside was nothing compared to the suffocating weight inside our home. My father crossed the antique Persian rug. He did not raise his hand to strike me. He did not need to. His presence alone carried a crushing physical weight. He stopped inches from my face, crowding into my space, forcing me to press my back against the carved wooden banister of the staircase. "You spiteful little creature," he spat, his voice dropping into a low venomous register. "You try to destroy your brother's future because you are a bitter invisible nothing." The words landed like fists against my sternum. He knew exactly where to aim. He was weaponizing the silence and isolation he and my mother had enforced upon me for 15 years. By calling me invisible, he was confirming out loud the exact role they had assigned me since I was a small child. He was not acting out of parental disappointment. He was performing as an executioner protecting his preferred heir. I pivoted away from his glare and turned desperately toward the sofa. "Mom," I pleaded, my voice cracking from the strain. "You know me. You know I would never do something like this. Just call the school office tomorrow morning. Ask them to pull the hallway security footage from yesterday afternoon. The cameras will show you everything." I reached my hand out toward her, begging for one flicker of maternal protection. Margaret Whitmore did not reach back. Instead, she tightened her grip on Bennett's shoulders. She deliberately turned her body away from me, tucking her chin downward, choosing willful blindness over the obvious truth. A mother is supposed to be a shield for her children. Mine was a fortress built specifically to harbor my abuser. From his safe harbor behind our mother, Bennett shifted his posture. He lifted his head just enough to meet my eyes over her shoulder. The fake tears had miraculously evaporated. For a single fraction of a second, the corners of his mouth lifted upward. He smirked. It was a cold, triumphant expression of pure satisfaction. It was the exact same look he had given me when he pocketed our mother's $100 bill the year before. He was sending a silent message in the private language only the two of us understood. He had won the war. He owned the story. He controlled the audience. And I was nothing more than the collateral damage required for his survival. The sight of that smirk severed the last thread holding my composure together. "He is lying," I screamed, jabbing my finger directly at his smug face. "You are letting him destroy my entire life to cover up his own failures. He stole that exam himself." My father seized my upper arm. His grip was iron. His fingers dug through the wool of my sweater and bit into my flesh. "Get out," he ordered. He dragged me toward the slate-tiled entryway. My loafers slipped against the polished hardwood as I tried to dig my heels in. "Dad, wait," I gasped, struggling against the force of his grip. "The roads are sheeted with ice. The governor declared a coastal emergency this morning. The news said to stay off the highways. Even the Metro North trains were canceled." My father did not care about the meteorological forecast. He did not care about state emergency declarations or black ice warnings. He cared only about purging the threat to his manufactured reality. He marched me to the front hall closet, yanked it open, and grabbed my thin spring windbreaker off a wooden hanger. He shoved the jacket hard into my chest. I stumbled backward. My shoulder blades collided with the heavy oak of the front door. "I will not have a defective daughter in this house," he said, his eyes hollow and empty of anything resembling human warmth. "Do not come back to this address until you are ready to confess what you did. Do not come back until you are willing to beg your brother for forgiveness on your knees." He reached around my waist, twisted the brass doorknob, and pulled the front door open. The storm immediately rushed into the entryway, blasting us with a wall of freezing mist and stinging sleet. He shoved me out onto the slate front steps. The massive oak door slammed shut behind me with a heavy thud. I stood there in shock and listened to the deadbolt slide into place with a sharp, definitive click. I stood frozen on the doormat. It took less than 30 seconds for the freezing rain to penetrate the thin nylon of my windbreaker. The temperature was hovering just below freezing. The wind chill made the air slice through my clothes like razors. I pounded my fists against the wet oak of the front door. I screamed until my throat tasted like copper. Nobody came to the window. A moment later, the porch light clicked off, plunging me into the cold blue darkness of the storm. I pulled my flip phone from the front pocket of my jeans with numb, trembling fingers. I pressed the power button, praying for a signal, praying for battery life. The screen stayed black. The battery had died sometime during fifth period. My charger was sitting plugged into the wall outlet beside my twin bed. I had no cash. I had no debit card. I was 15 years old, standing in the middle of a catastrophic weather event, and I was completely alone. Survival instinct eventually overrides panic. I knew I could not stay on the front steps. Hypothermia is a quiet, polite killer, and my teeth were already chattering uncontrollably. I zipped the flimsy windbreaker up to my chin, pulled the inadequate hood over my soaked hair, and stepped off the slate stoop into the freezing slush flooding our front walkway. I needed a destination. The old Greenwich police station was over 4 miles away on the other side of town. My few classmates lived in heavily gated estates behind private security checkpoints I could not access on foot. My only realistic option was the clam shack at the marina where I washed dishes. It was just under 2 miles away, and the night manager, an older woman named Donna, often kept the back kitchen running until midnight during the off-season. I figured I could sit in the storage room, drink hot coffee, and figure out how to contact a youth shelter. I turned right out of our circular driveway and merged onto the shoulder of Shore Road. The coastal highway was a nightmare. The storm drains had backed up entirely. The right lane had transformed into a fast-moving river of icy runoff. The street lamps flickered intermittently, struggling against the strain on the regional power grid. I kept my head bowed, leaning my weight forward to slice through the relentless howling gusts blowing in off Long Island Sound. Cars passed infrequently, but when they did, they kicked up enormous walls of black slush that drenched my shins and filled my loafers. Every single step felt like dragging cinder blocks. As I walked, the physical agony began to merge with the psychological wreckage. The words my father had spoken echoed louder than the cracking branches above me. Defective daughter. Invisible nothing. In the freezing darkness, I finally understood the core mechanism of my family. They did not simply prefer Bennett over me. They required my destruction to sustain his illusion. They needed a designated receptacle for his failures. A perpetual loser. So that he could play the hero. If I returned tomorrow morning and confessed to a crime I did not commit, I would be signing a lifelong contract to play the villain in their story. I made a silent promise to myself, placing one numb foot in front of the other. I would make it to the clam shack. I would find a phone. I would call the State Department of Children and Families. And I would never set foot in that colonial again. I would rather be a ward of the state of Connecticut than a permanent shield for a liar. I was about halfway there. The faded blue neon sign of the marina was still a mile ahead, obscured by the thick sheets of horizontal sleet. I approached the large intersection at the foot of the bridge. The traffic lights had lost power. They swung dead and dark on their cables above the asphalt. The visibility was almost zero. The sleet was falling so densely it looked like a solid wall of static. I paused at the curb, waiting for a break in the wind. I told myself I just needed to push through this one final crossing. I told myself the worst part of the night was already behind me. I stepped off the curb and into the flooded intersection. I heard the sound before I ever saw the source. It was the high-pitched mechanical scream of heavy commercial tires fighting against a glassy hydroplane surface. A pair of yellow halogen headlights pierced the gray static to my left. They were moving far too fast for the conditions, sliding sideways across the icy lanes, heading directly for the crosswalk. I tried to leap backward. My soaked loafers slipped on the painted white line. I never made it to the clam shack. The impact lacked any cinematic grace. There was no slow-motion reflection. There was no profound final thought. The grill of a commercial delivery van struck my left hip with a dull, sickening crunch. The force launched my body off the asphalt and sent me spinning through the freezing air. I landed hard in the frozen drainage ditch lining the shoulder. My shoulder collided with the edge of a concrete culvert. A blinding flash of white-hot pain ripped through my collarbone. The metallic taste of blood filled my mouth. The world tilted. The roar of the storm faded into a thick, buzzing silence. Then the darkness swallowed me whole. I drifted in that silent void for hours. My return to consciousness was slow and deeply unpleasant. The freezing rain had been replaced by the sterile, dry chill of an emergency room trauma bay. The howling wind was gone, replaced by the steady mechanical beep of a heart monitor and the low hum of fluorescent ceiling panels. My eyelids felt like they had been weighted with sand. I forced them open, squinting against the harsh white glare. I tried to shift my weight and immediately choked on a sharp gasp. My right arm was immobilized in a thick canvas sling. My collarbone radiated a deep, structural ache. My skull throbbed with the heavy pressure of a severe concussion. I tasted iodine and dry cotton. I turned my head a fraction of an inch toward the right side of the hospital bed. I expected to see an exhausted nurse charting my vital signs. I expected to see a uniformed state trooper waiting to ask about the hit and run. I did not expect the figure sitting in the cheap vinyl visitor chair beside my bed. The woman sat with perfectly rigid posture. She wore a flawless ivory wool blazer over a crisp navy silk blouse. Her silver hair was pulled back into an immaculate French twist. She looked entirely out of place in the chaotic, blood-streaked environment of a county trauma ward. She looked like a chief executive officer about to chair a hostile board meeting at the Plaza Hotel. It was Grandma Adelaide. The breath stalled in my lungs. I had not seen this woman in 10 years. My last memory of her was from my 5th birthday party, before the Great Family Schism severed her from our lives entirely. Adelaide Whitmore was a legend wrapped inside a forbidden subject in our household. She had built a commercial real estate empire across Fairfield County and Westchester through sheer ruthless discipline. She had zero tolerance for laziness and zero patience for entitlement. My father had inherited none of her work ethic, but he expected to inherit every dollar of her fortune. 10 years earlier, my father had demanded a massive seed investment from her for a poorly researched yacht brokerage venture. Adelaide had reviewed his sloppy business plan, called him a lazy fool to his face, and severed the financial relationship. She removed him from her trust documents. She banned him from her properties in Greenwich and Manhattan. In retaliation, my father had banned her name from being spoken in our colonial. He painted her as a heartless, controlling tyrant. He blamed her for every minor financial strain we ever experienced, hiding his own mediocrity behind her supposed cruelty. Yet here the supposed tyrant sat keeping vigil in a trauma ward at 3 o'clock in the morning. "Eleanor," she said. Her voice was smooth, carrying the unmistakable edge of authority that commanded instant attention. "Do not try to sit up. You have a hairline fracture in your clavicle and a grade 2 concussion. The trauma team wants to keep you for 48 hours of observation." I swallowed hard, trying to generate enough saliva to speak. "How?" I rasped, my throat raw from screaming on the front steps hours earlier. "How are you here?" Adelaide leaned forward. She poured a small paper cup of water from a plastic pitcher and guided the bent straw to my lips. She did not coddle me. She did not stroke my hair. She moved with efficient, tactical precision. "The paramedics found your damp student identification card in the front pocket of your windbreaker," Adelaide explained, setting the cup back down on the tray table. "The charge nurse called the primary home number listed in your medical file. She dialed the old Greenwich house 3 separate times. Your father and your mother let the phone ring out every single time. They ignored the calls deliberately." A fresh wave of nausea rolled through me, completely separate from the concussion. They had been awake. I knew they had been awake. They had ignored the calls because they assumed it was me standing at a payphone, calling to beg for forgiveness. They were playing a waiting game with my submission, completely unaware that I was bleeding into a drainage ditch on Shore Road. They prioritized their pride over my survival. When the primary contacts failed to respond, Adelaide continued, her sharp blue eyes locking onto mine. The hospital social worker accessed the school district's emergency database to locate a secondary contact. They found my name and my direct office line in Stamford. I closed my eyes, letting a wave of pure relief wash over the throbbing pain. 6 months earlier, recognizing the escalating volatility inside our household, I had walked into the school guidance office during a free period. I told the administrative assistant I needed to update my medical file. I forged my parents' signatures on the form and added Adelaide as a secondary emergency contact. I had found her office number listed on the corporate website of Whitmore Holdings. It had been a blind, desperate insurance policy. I had never genuinely expected to need it. "You planned ahead," Adelaide stated. It was not a question. It was an acknowledgement of my survival instincts. "You knew the floor was going to drop out from beneath you eventually." I nodded slowly. The motion sent a sharp spike of pain shooting down my neck. Adelaide folded her hands neatly in her lap. She looked at my bruised face, the road grit still caught under my fingernails, the wet clothes balled up inside a plastic hospital bag in the corner of the room. Her expression did not soften into pity. Pity is a useless gift to offer a victim. Instead, her eyes hardened into a cold, lethal clarity. "They threw you out," she said. The blunt, factual nature of her statement shattered the final wall of my endurance. I had spent 15 years holding back tears, shrinking myself smaller, pretending the relentless neglect did not hurt. But hearing the truth spoken aloud by an adult who saw the situation for exactly what it was broke me open. The dam collapsed. My chest heaved. I sobbed. The force of the crying pulled painfully against my fractured collarbone. I cried for the straight-A student who had scrubbed shellfish residue from steel pots to fund her own exam fees. I cried for the girl who had been framed by her own brother. I cried for the daughter who had been pushed into a freezing ice storm because her father required a permanent scapegoat. Adelaide did not shush me. She did not promise that everything would be all right. She stood up from the vinyl chair, took one measured step closer to the bed, and placed her cool hand over my uninjured wrist. Her grip was iron. She anchored me to the present reality. "Cry tonight, Eleanor," she said firmly, her voice cutting cleanly through my panic. "Purge the weakness. Mourn the parents you never actually had." I looked up at her, my vision blurred with hot tears. "Because tomorrow," Adelaide continued, her tone dropping into a steel register, "we stop crying. Tomorrow we begin building. You are a Whitmore. We do not tolerate betrayal. We do not allow weakness to dictate our future." The words struck something deep inside my chest. A tiny flickering ember of agency. For 15 years, I had believed I was a helpless passenger in my own life. Adelaide was handing me the keys to the vehicle. She was offering me a blueprint for armor. I drew a shaky breath, wiped my healthy arm across my wet face, and nodded firmly. Adelaide glanced at the slim gold watch on her left wrist. She smoothed the lapels of her ivory blazer and turned her gaze toward the heavy wooden door of the hospital room. "The Old Greenwich Police dispatched a patrol car to your father's residence 10 minutes ago," Adelaide noted. "They have informed Richard of your location. He is currently driving here." My heart rate spiked sharply on the monitor beside the bed. The rhythmic beeping accelerated into a frantic tempo. The thought of seeing my father, of facing the man who had locked the deadbolt while I stood freezing on the front steps, sent pure adrenaline coursing through my veins. He was coming to reclaim his property. He was coming to spin the story, manipulate the doctors, and drag me back to the suburban prison to serve my sentence. Adelaide reached over and pressed a button on the heart monitor, silencing the alarm. She did not appear worried in the slightest. She looked like a predator watching a snare tighten around an oblivious target. "Let your heart rate settle," Adelaide instructed, stepping between my bed and the door, creating a physical barricade. "Richard believes he is walking into this room to retrieve a runaway child. He believes he holds all the leverage. He has no idea he is walking directly into a slaughterhouse." I sank back against the stiff hospital pillows. The throbbing in my skull faded into the background. The fear evaporated into anticipation. I watched the heavy wooden door, waiting for the golden child's protector to finally meet his match. The hospital room door stayed closed for another 20 minutes. I listened to the small sounds of the trauma ward. The squeak of rubber soles on polished linoleum. The low metallic hum of medical equipment. Then I heard a specific set of footsteps approaching down the corridor. A heavy, measured tread accompanied by the sharp click of low pumps. My parents had arrived. I braced myself against the pillows. The doorknob turned. My father strode into the room first. My mother trailed closely behind him. They did not rush. They did not burst through the doorway frantically searching for their injured daughter. They strolled in with a weary, irritated posture of inconvenienced adults responding to a minor disruption. My father wore his charcoal trench coat, his silver hair combed neatly. He was clearly prepared to deploy his practiced country club charm. I could see the false narrative forming behind his pale blue eyes. He expected to find a gullible social worker holding a clipboard. He was ready to sigh, shake his head, and explain how his troubled, rebellious daughter had run away after a minor family disagreement. He was ready to play the exhausted, dedicated patriarch. He stepped past the privacy curtain and froze. His confident stride halted so abruptly that my mother bumped into the back of his coat. The practiced charm drained from his face, replaced by raw, undisguised terror. He stared at the vinyl chair beside my bed. Adelaide did not move immediately. She allowed the silence to stretch, forcing him to absorb her presence fully. For a decade, my father had controlled the narrative inside our home. He had painted his estranged mother as an irrational tyrant to justify his own financial failures. He had banished her name to protect his fragile ego. Now the myth he had built was sitting 3 feet away, staring at him with cold, surgical eyes. "Mother," my father whispered. His voice had lost every ounce of the booming authority he had used on me hours earlier. It was a hollow, breathless sound. His hands, shoved deep into the pockets of his trench coat, began to shake. The tremor traveled up his arms, visible even through the thick wool fabric. Adelaide rose to her feet. She was a woman of average height, but in the confined space of that sterile trauma room, she commanded the atmosphere like a colossus. She fastened the center button of her ivory blazer. A deliberate, professional gesture that signaled the formal beginning of a negotiation he had already lost. "Richard," Adelaide said. Her voice carried the chill of fracturing ice. "You look exactly the same. Time has not improved your character." My father swallowed visibly. He took a half step backward. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his eyes darting toward the door as if calculating an escape. "The police called me. They said Eleanor was in an accident. She is my daughter. This is a private family matter. You forfeited every right to privacy the moment you locked a 15-year-old girl out of your house during a declared state of emergency," Adelaide replied smoothly. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Genuine power never shouts. My mother peeked out from behind my father's shoulder. Her eyes widened at the sight of her estranged mother-in-law. "Margaret," Adelaide noted, shifting her gaze for a single fraction of a second. "Still standing behind your husband. Still enabling his cowardice." My mother flinched and looked down at the polished tile floor. She did not look at me. She did not ask about the heavy sling immobilizing my right arm or the dark purple bruises blooming across my left cheekbone. My father tried to rally. He squared his shoulders, summoning the patriarchal dominance he wielded so effortlessly back in Old Greenwich. "You do not understand the situation," he argued, pointing a shaking finger in my direction. "This was a necessary disciplinary action. She is deeply disturbed. She stole the final exam from her high school and tried to frame Bennett. She tried to destroy her brother's acceptance to Princeton because she is consumed with jealousy. We were forced to use tough love." Adelaide did not blink. She allowed his pathetic excuse to hang in the sterile air. "Bennett is a lazy parasite," Adelaide stated. Her words landed like anvils on the polished linoleum. "He is a mediocre student and a documented liar. He is the exact replica of you, Richard. He expects the world to hand him rewards. He lacks the discipline to earn anything on his own. You know he planted those papers. You simply chose to sacrifice your daughter to protect your own fragile reflection in the mirror." My father opened his mouth to protest, but Adelaide cut him off with a sharp slice of her hand through the air. "We are not debating the fiction you sell to your friends at the field club," Adelaide said. "We are discussing the legal reality of your current situation. I have spent the last 2 hours making phone calls. I have spoken to the responding state troopers. I have filed an emergency report with the Connecticut Department of Children and Families. I have activated my primary legal team in Manhattan." The mention of attorneys drained the remaining defiance from my father's posture. He knew Adelaide kept a roster of ruthless corporate lawyers on permanent retainer. He knew he could not afford a single billable hour of their time. "I am taking Eleanor," Adelaide announced.